Hey there, night owls. Tonight we're talking about the most ambitious knowledge project in the ancient world, a library so obsessed with collecting every book on Earth that they literally confiscated scrolls from ships docking in the harbour. No, seriously, they'd seize your manuscripts, make copies and return the knockoffs while keeping the originals. That's the kind of aggressive scholarship we're dealing with here. Alexandria wasn't just some dusty archive. It was a state-funded machine for hoarding human knowledge, a lighthouse guiding ships while its library tried to capture the entire world in text. This is the story of how one city turned books into power, and how that power changed everything. Before we dive in, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from right now? I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's explore the library that tried to own all human thought. Ready? Let's go! So let's talk about how Alexandria came to exist in the first place. Because this wasn't some organic settlement that grew up around a nice well or a convenient river crossing. This was deliberate. This was Alexander the Great looking at a stretch of Egyptian coastline in 331 BCE and essentially saying __(0__). And then, because he was Alexander the Great and had that kind of authority, it actually happened. Though to be fair, he didn't stick around to watch the construction. He had other places to conquer, other cities to name after himself, because apparently one wasn't quite enough for the man's ego. The location he chose, though, that was genuinely brilliant. We're talking about a narrow strip of land squeezed between the Mediterranean Sea to the north and Lake Mareotis to the south. Now, if you're thinking this sounds like a recipe for flooding and logistical nightmares, you're not entirely wrong. But Alexander, or more accurately his city planner, a guy named Dinocreades, who was basically the ancient world's star architect, saw something else entirely. They saw a natural fortress. They saw a place where you could control both sea trade and river trade simultaneously. They saw, in modern terms, a customs checkpoint with a view. Lake Mareotis, which most people today have never heard of, was absolutely crucial to this whole setup. It wasn't just some decorative water feature. This lake connected directly to the Nile through a series of canals, which meant that everything flowing down from Upper Egypt, grain, papyrus, granite, basically the entire economic output of one of the ancient world's wealthiest regions, had to pass through or near this spot. Meanwhile, the Mediterranean coast provided access to the entire trading network of the Greek world, the Italian peninsula, North Africa, you name it. Put these two things together, and you've essentially created the ancient equivalent of a major international airport, except with more papyrus and fewer overpriced sandwiches. The strip of land between the sea and the lake was maybe a mile wide at most. Not exactly sprawling real estate. But that narrowness was actually a feature, not a bug, because it meant the city could be defended relatively easily. Any army trying to attack by land would have to navigate this thin corridor with water on both sides, which is, strategically speaking, not ideal if you're the attacker. It's the kind of defensive advantage that military planners dream about, though presumably the architects were less thrilled about the limited space for urban planning. ___1__. Now, here's where it gets interesting from a pure logistics standpoint. The Mediterranean coast along this part of Egypt is notoriously difficult for harbours. The coastline is relatively straight. There are no deep natural bays, and the prevailing currents and winds are not particularly cooperative. It's the kind of coast where ancient sailors would generally prefer to keep moving rather than stop. So how do you build a major port city on a coastline that's fundamentally hostile to major port cities? You engineer your way around the problem, naturally. About a mile offshore from where Alexander was standing and having his urban planning epiphany, there was an island called Pharos. Not a big island, maybe a mile and a half long, shaped sort of like someone dropped a lumpy piece of bread into the sea. On its own, Pharos was unremarkable, but in relation to the mainland it was perfect, because if you could somehow connect that island to the shore, you'd create two harbours instead of one, with the island and the connecting causeway acting as a massive breakwater. The eastern harbour would face Greece and Asia Minor, the western harbour would handle Egyptian and North African traffic. Two harbours meant twice the docking capacity, twice the customs revenue, and twice the opportunities to inspect and confiscate interesting manuscripts from incoming ships, though that particular business model came later. Building a causeway nearly a mile long through open water was not, shall we say, a weekend DIY project. This was a multi-decade engineering feat that required dumping absolutely staggering quantities of stone and rubble into the Mediterranean. We're talking about creating an artificial land bridge substantial enough to support not just foot traffic, but heavy cargo, wagon traffic, and eventually aqueducts. The Greeks called this causeway the heptastadion, which translates roughly to 7 stades long, a stade being about 600 feet. The name basically means, this thing is absurdly long. Very poetic, those ancient Greeks. The construction of the heptastadion fundamentally changed the hydrology of the entire coastline. Before the causeway, ocean currents flowed freely along the coast. After the causeway, you had 2 semi-enclosed harbours with different current patterns, different water depths, different silting rates. Over centuries, the heptastadion trapped so much sediment on its western side that what had been open water eventually became land. The modern city of Alexandria is significantly wider than the ancient version, specifically because the heptastadion spent 2,000 years acting as the world's slowest land reclamation project. Sometimes infrastructure has long-term effects that the original engineers never quite anticipated, though to be fair, planning for millennial-scale sediment deposits probably wasn't high on their priority list. The eastern harbour, called the Great Harbour, or sometimes Portus Magnus, became the main commercial port. This was where the big merchant ships docked, where the grain fleets assembled, where visiting dignitaries arrived. It was protected from the worst of the Mediterranean weather by Pharos Island and the heptastadion, which meant ships could dock relatively safely even in conditions that would make other harbours unusable. The harbour floor was apparently dredged regularly to maintain depth, a never-ending battle against sediment that employed whole crews of workers whose job was essentially shoveling mud underwater. Not exactly glamorous work, but absolutely essential for keeping the city's economic lifeline functional. The western harbour was called Eunostos, __quote_for__, which has a nice ring to it, though it was actually the slightly less prestigious of the 2 harbours. This was more of a working port, handling local traffic, fishing boats, the grain barges coming in from Lake Mareotis via the canal system. Eunostos also housed the city's shipyards, because nothing says safe return like the constant sound of hammering and the smell of hot pitch from ship repairs. The shipyards were important enough that they got their own protected harbour basin called Kibotus, the box, which was basically an artificial dock complex carved out of the shoreline specifically for building and maintaining warships. The Ptolemies took their navy seriously, and you can't have a serious navy without serious shipbuilding infrastructure. Between these 2 harbours, on the heptastadion itself, a whole secondary economy emerged. There were shops, warehouses, smaller docks for fishing boats and ferries. The causeway became a commercial district in its own right, a sort of mile-long strip mall connecting the island to the mainland. If you were walking from the island to the city proper, you'd pass fishmongers, taverns, money changers, all the businesses that spring up wherever large numbers of travellers with money in their pockets need to be temporarily separated from that money. The ancient equivalent of airport retail, except with better fish and worse waiting areas. On the mainland side, the city itself was laid out in a grid pattern, which was very fashionable in Hellenistic urban planning. Alexander's architect Dinocrates designed broad, straight avenues running east-west and north-south, intersecting at right angles, creating city blocks of roughly uniform size. This was cutting-edge urban design for the 4th century BCE, the kind of rational planning that made older, organically grown cities look hopelessly chaotic by comparison. The main east-west avenue, called the Canopic Way, was reportedly about 100 feet wide and ran the entire length of the city. That's wider than most modern highways. You could march an entire military formation down the Canopic Way, with room left over for pedestrian traffic on the sides. Not that they did this regularly, but the capability was there, which says something about the Ptolemies' priorities. When designing your capital city, apparently it's important to ensure that you can deploy troops quickly to any district if the need arises. Just good planning, really. The main north-south avenue was nearly as impressive, and the intersection of these 2 major streets formed the functional centre of the city. This wasn't the exact geographic centre. That honour went to a location slightly to the east, but it was the centre that mattered for daily life. Markets, administrative buildings, temples, all the infrastructure of urban life clustered around this intersection. If you needed something in Alexandria, whether that was exotic spices, legal documents, or a sacrifice performed to your preferred deity, you'd probably start your search somewhere near this central crossroads. It was the ancient equivalent of downtown, except with more columns and fewer Starbucks. The city was divided into 5 districts, each named after a letter of the Greek alphabet: Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, and Epsilon. Subtle naming system, that. The royal quarter, where the palace complex and eventually the library would be located, occupied a huge chunk of the Beta district near the eastern harbour. This wasn't just a palace, this was a palace quarter, a walled city within a city that included royal residences, administrative buildings, gardens, the museum, the library, barracks, treasuries, the whole apparatus of Ptolemaic government. Something like a quarter or even a third of the entire city was basically off-limits to regular citizens, reserved exclusively for the royal court and its associated institutions, because nothing says quote 7 quite like walling off the nicest part of town for yourself and your friends. The Jewish community, which would eventually become one of the largest Jewish populations outside Judea, primarily occupied the Delta district in the eastern part of the city. The Egyptians, meaning the native Egyptian population as opposed to the Greek colonists, tended to cluster in the western districts. This wasn't legally enforced segregation exactly, but it was definitely the social reality. Different ethnic communities lived in different neighbourhoods, operated different institutions, sometimes even followed different legal codes for internal disputes. Alexandria was multicultural in the sense that multiple cultures existed within its walls, not in the sense that they all blended into some harmonious melting pot. More of a salad bowl, really, where the ingredients remained distinct even while occupying the same dish. The southern side of the city, facing Lake Mareotis, was where the canal system connected to the Nile. There were docks, warehouses, customs houses, all the infrastructure needed to handle river traffic. The grain fleets that fed not just Alexandria, but eventually much of the Mediterranean world would offload their cargo here, transferring it to warehouses before it was either consumed locally or reloaded onto seagoing vessels in the Great Harbour. The entire southern waterfront was basically one long logistics operation, a supply chain made physical. Thousands of workers loading and unloading barges, inspectors checking quantities and quality, scribes recording every transaction in duplicate and triplicate because bureaucracy was alive and well in the ancient world. The lake itself was a major economic asset. Fishing was obviously important. You're not going to have a large freshwater lake next to your city and not exploit it for food. But Lake Mareotis also provided access to the agricultural heartland of the Nile Delta. The canals connecting the lake to the Nile meant that goods could flow from deep in the interior of Egypt directly to Alexandria without having to navigate the Nile's mouths at the coast, which were notoriously silted and difficult. Instead, cargo could come down the Nile, turn west into the canal system, cross Lake Mareotis, and arrive at the southern docks of Alexandria. From an economic geography standpoint, the city was brilliantly positioned to be the funnel through which Egypt's wealth flowed to the Mediterranean world. This also meant that controlling Alexandria meant controlling Egypt's access to international trade. The Ptolemies understood this perfectly well, which is why they invested so heavily in the city's infrastructure. If you're a king trying to maintain control over a large, wealthy, and somewhat resentful subject population, and let's be clear, most native Egyptians were not thrilled about being ruled by Macedonian Greeks, then controlling the economic choke points is excellent policy. Want to export grain? You go through Alexandria. Want to import wine, olive oil, timber, metals from the Mediterranean world? You go through Alexandria. Want to trade with the East via the Red Sea route? Well, that cargo has to cross Egypt somehow, and the most efficient route runs through, you guessed it, Alexandria. The city was effectively a giant customs house with delusions of grandeur. Water was always going to be a challenge. You've got a city built on a narrow strip of land between salt water and a lake, in a region where rainfall is minimal at best. The Nile floods predictably every year, but Alexandria isn't on the Nile, it's on the coast. So how do you supply fresh water to what would eventually become a city of maybe 500,000 people? You build an aqueduct, obviously. Or in Alexandria's case, you build several aqueducts, plus a network of cisterns, plus a system of canals, plus some engineering solutions that historians are still arguing about because the archaeological evidence got built over centuries ago. The main aqueduct system brought water from the Nile via a canal that connected to Lake Mareotis. The water would flow through underground channels and surface cisterns distributed throughout the city. Houses of wealthy families would have private cisterns, essentially basement water storage tanks lined with waterproof plaster. Public cisterns served the rest of the population. The water itself wasn't exactly pristine by modern standards. This was the ancient world, so the concept of treating water for bacteria hadn't been invented yet. But it was good enough for drinking, cooking, bathing, and all the other activities that require large quantities of water. Good enough, that is, unless the Nile was running particularly low or the canal system got blocked, at which point everyone was reminded that living in a desert next to the sea presents certain logistical challenges that central heating and thermal underwear can't solve. Unfortunately, those technologies were still many centuries away. The Pharos lighthouse, which would eventually become one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, wasn't built immediately. That came later under Ptolemy II, probably starting around 280 BCE and taking something like 20 years to complete. But even before the lighthouse, the island of Pharos served as a navigational landmark. The point of a lighthouse, after all, is to be visible from far out to sea, and even a tall tower or a beacon fire on high ground serves that purpose to some extent. The legendary lighthouse that later stood on the island, we're talking about a structure that ancient sources claim was over 400 feet tall, which would make it one of the tallest buildings in the world until well into the modern era, was the culmination of this navigational function, not its beginning. The lighthouse design was supposedly 3-tiered, a square bottom section, an octagonal middle section, and a circular top section where the actual fire burned. A mirror, possibly made of polished bronze, reflected the light out to sea, making it visible for many miles. During the day, a column of smoke served the same purpose. The whole structure was both architecturally impressive and functionally essential, because guiding ships into harbour safely meant protecting cargo, which meant protecting customs revenue, which meant funding everything else the Ptolemies wanted to do. You don't build a 400-foot lighthouse just to show off, though the showing off part certainly didn't hurt. This was engineering as advertisement, a massive stone declaration that Alexandria was a city that could afford to build impractical monuments to its own greatness, while also making them serve practical purposes. Inside the lighthouse, there was supposedly a spiral ramp that allowed donkeys to carry fuel to the top, because if you're burning a fire every night at the top of a 400-foot tower, you need a constant supply of wood or whatever else you're burning, and hauling that up 400 feet of stairs is nobody's idea of a good career path. Much better to have the donkeys do it. The lighthouse keepers who tended the fire and the mirror probably lived in the structure itself, spending their days maintaining equipment and their nights making sure ships didn't crash into rocks. Not the most glamorous job in Alexandria, but certainly one with job security. Cities need lighthouses the way they need sewers. Nobody thinks about them until they stop working. The Heptastadion and the lighthouse weren't just infrastructure, they were also defensive works. The Ptolemies were ruling a kingdom surrounded by potential enemies, rival Hellenistic kingdoms to the east and north, native Egyptian populations who might resent foreign rule, ambitious generals with armies. Having a capital city that was difficult to attack was worth the investment. The harbour entrance could be chained off or blocked with ships if an enemy fleet approached. The Heptastadion could be defended like a fortified bridge. The royal quarter had its own walls within the city walls. Alexandria was built to be defensible in layers, each layer falling back to a more secure inner core if the outer defences failed. Paranoid maybe, but the Hellenistic period was not known for its political stability, so a little paranoia was arguably justified. Trade routes that passed through Alexandria carried more than just physical goods. They carried ideas, techniques, religious practices, languages, philosophies. When a merchant ship from Rhodes docked in the great harbour, it brought not just wine and pottery but also news from the Aegean, architectural styles, medical theories, mathematical techniques. When a grain barge arrived from Upper Egypt, it brought not just wheat but also Egyptian religious practices, artistic motifs, linguistic influences. The city was designed as a physical hub for trade, but it inevitably became an intellectual hub as well. You can't concentrate that many people from that many different backgrounds in one location without creating a certain intellectual ferment, even if that wasn't part of the original city plan. The grid layout of the streets, while aesthetically pleasing and militarily practical, also had economic implications. Uniform city blocks meant standardized property sizes, which meant simpler tax assessment and easier urban administration. When you're running a major city in an era before computers or even particularly good maps, and simplicity in urban layout translates directly to efficiency in governance, the rectangular grid was basically an optimization algorithm in physical form, a way to reduce the complexity of managing a large urban population. It didn't make Alexandria's bureaucracy actually enjoyable. No bureaucracy in history has ever been enjoyable. But it made it marginally less awful than it might otherwise have been, which was probably the best anyone could hope for. Markets in Alexandria operated on a scale that would have been impressive in any era. The main agora, or marketplace, was enormous. Ancient sources describe it as being large enough to hold public assemblies of the entire citizen body, which given Alexandria's population would mean tens of thousands of people. This wasn't just a place to buy vegetables. This was the economic heart of the city, where wholesalers dealt in bulk goods, where bankers offered loans and currency exchange, where ships' captains negotiated contracts, where merchants from different countries argued over prices through interpreters. The noise level alone must have been incredible. Imagine the world's busiest stock exchange crossed with the world's largest farmers' market, except with no loudspeakers and everyone shouting to be heard over everyone else. Good luck finding a quiet workspace in that environment. The cosmopolitan nature of the city was apparent from the beginning. Alexander intended Alexandria to be a Greek city, and it was certainly ruled by Greeks and organised along Greek cultural lines. But it was also built on Egyptian land using Egyptian labour for the purpose of extracting and redistributing Egyptian wealth. The Egyptian population wasn't just a minority in the countryside. There were Egyptians in the city itself working in the markets, serving in the temples, operating businesses. And beyond Greeks and Egyptians, there were Jews, Syrians, Phoenicians, Libyans, Nubians, traders from the Arabian Peninsula, visitors from as far away as India. Every language around the Mediterranean and beyond could be heard in Alexandria's streets, which must have created interesting challenges for anyone trying to conduct business or governance. The Jewish community deserves particular mention because it would eventually become so important to the city's intellectual life. Jews had been present in Egypt for centuries before Alexandria was founded. The biblical story of Exodus. Notwithstanding, there were significant Jewish populations in Egypt going back to at least the 7th century BCE. When Alexandria was established, Jews migrated to the new city along with everyone else seeking opportunity. Under the Ptolemies, the Jewish community enjoyed a substantial degree of autonomy, maintaining their own laws and religious practices while participating in the broader economic life of the city. This arrangement worked reasonably well for most of the Ptolemaic period, though there were definitely tensions, particularly as the Jewish population grew large enough to become politically significant. One of the interesting aspects of Alexandria's founding is how quickly it became important. Most cities grow slowly, accumulating population and wealth over generations. Alexandria went from quote 8 to quote 9 in basically one human lifetime. By the time Alexander's immediate successors were squabbling over his empire, a squabbling that historians call the Wars of the Diadochi, which is Greek for the Wars of the Successors, because historians love their Greek terminology, Alexandria was already important enough to be worth fighting over. Ptolemy I, who had established the dynasty that ruled Egypt for the next 3 centuries, recognized Alexandria's strategic value immediately and made it his capital instead of Memphis, the traditional Egyptian capital. This was a significant choice, one that effectively declared that the new regime would be Mediterranean-facing rather than Nile-facing, Greek rather than Egyptian in its primary orientation. Memphis, located on the Nile south of modern Cairo, had been Egypt's capital for thousands of years. It was the symbolic heart of pharaonic Egypt, the administrative centre of the traditional Egyptian state. By making Alexandria the capital instead, Ptolemy was essentially saying that his kingdom would be something new, a hybrid Greek-Egyptian state oriented toward the Mediterranean world rather than the Nilotic interior. This didn't make him particularly popular with traditional Egyptian elites, but Ptolemy wasn't primarily concerned with being popular with traditional Egyptian elites. He was concerned with maintaining control of a wealthy kingdom, while participating in the broader power struggles of the Hellenistic world, and Alexandria was much better positioned for both of those objectives than Memphis. The city's location also made it easier to defend against rivals coming from the east. The Seleucid Empire, which controlled much of the former Persian Empire and was Rome's main rival before Rome got around to conquering it, The Sinai Peninsula created a natural buffer between Egypt and the Levant, and Alexandria's coastal position meant that any army trying to attack it from the east would have a long march across difficult terrain before even reaching the city walls. Maritime approaches could be defended by the Ptolemaic navy, which was substantial enough to make any potential invader think twice. The city's defensive advantages weren't just theoretical. Alexandria would remain unconquered by external enemies for most of its ancient history, falling eventually not to superior military force but to internal decay and the gradual collapse of the Ptolemaic state. Let's talk about the smell for a moment, because ancient cities had a certain aromatic quality that modern people, accustomed to sewage systems and garbage collection, tend to underestimate. Alexandria was better than most ancient cities in this regard. The grid layout allowed for relatively good drainage, the sea breezes helped ventilate the city, and the Ptolemies apparently invested in some level of sanitation infrastructure. But it was still an ancient city with hundreds of thousands of people, plus horses, donkeys, cattle, and all the other animals that urban life required, plus fish markets, tanneries, dye works, all the smelly industries that cities need to function. The nice parts of town, particularly the royal quarter with its gardens and sea views, probably smelled relatively pleasant. The harbour districts and industrial areas, less so. This wasn't exactly a five-star living environment by modern standards, though by ancient standards it was probably pretty good. Water quality in the harbour varied. The eastern harbour, being more enclosed, probably had worse water quality than the western harbour. All those ships, all that human activity, all that sewage and industrial runoff going directly into a semi-enclosed body of water, it adds up. The harbour probably smelled worse in summer when the water was warmer and more stagnant. Ancient sources occasionally mention cleaning the harbours, which suggests that sediment and debris accumulation was an ongoing problem. You can't maintain a major port without dealing with the fact that harbours gradually fill with silt, garbage, shipwrecks, and various other materials that interfere with navigation. The unglamorous reality of ancient urbanism is that a huge amount of labour went into simply keeping things functional, maintaining water supplies, cleaning streets, repairing buildings, dredging harbours. The monuments and libraries get the historical attention, but the city worked because of people doing maintenance, not because of philosophers debating epistemology. The royal quarter was enclosed by walls, creating a sort of privileged island within the city. Inside those walls were the royal palaces, plural, because apparently one palace wasn't sufficient for the Ptolemaic court's needs, plus gardens, the museum, the library, temples, administrative buildings, and probably housing for high-ranking officials and scholars. This was where the real power resided, where decisions were made that affected the entire kingdom and, given Egypt's wealth and importance, much of the Mediterranean world. Access was controlled. You didn't just wander into the royal quarter to see what was happening. You were invited, or you were employed there, or you were not going in. This created a certain mystique around the institutions within the royal quarter. The library wasn't just some building you could visit on your lunch break, it was inside the walled enclave where the king lived, which made it simultaneously prestigious and inaccessible. The museum, which we'll discuss more later, was also in the royal quarter, and it was designed as a sort of research institute, where scholars could work on royal stipends. The connection to the palace was deliberate. The Ptolemies wanted to attract the best minds of the Greek world to Alexandria, and they did so by offering resources, prestige, and proximity to power. If you were an ambitious scholar in the 3rd century BCE, Alexandria represented opportunity. You could work in the best library in the world, interact with other leading intellectuals, and have your research supported by one of the wealthiest governments in existence. The trade-off was that you were working for a Hellenistic monarch, which meant your continued employment depended on royal favour, and royal favour in the Hellenistic world was notoriously fickle. But that's a trade-off many scholars apparently found acceptable, judging by the number of famous names associated with Alexandrian scholarship. The broader economic model of the city depended on Egypt's agricultural surplus. Egypt was, and remains, one of the most productive agricultural regions in the world, thanks to the Nile's annual flood cycle depositing fresh soil across the floodplain. The Ptolemies controlled this surplus through a sophisticated system of taxation and monopolies. Grain production was essentially a state enterprise. Farmers grew wheat and barley, the state collected a substantial portion of the harvest as taxes, and the royal administration then sold that grain on the international market. Alexandria was the outlet through which this state-controlled grain supply reached Mediterranean buyers. This made the city incredibly wealthy, but it also meant that the city's prosperity depended on the continued functioning of the agricultural system in the Nile Valley and Delta, which depended on the flood, which depended on rainfall in the Ethiopian highlands 1,000 miles away. Lots of moving parts in that particular supply chain. Beyond grain, Egypt produced papyrus, which was basically the paper of the ancient world. Papyrus grew in the Nile Delta marshes, and manufacturing papyrus sheets required specialized knowledge and labor. The Ptolemies, recognizing a valuable monopoly when they saw one, controlled papyrus production and export. If you wanted to write something down anywhere in the Mediterranean world, you were probably writing on Egyptian papyrus, which meant you were indirectly paying taxes to the Ptolemaic treasury. This is the kind of economic advantage that makes running a kingdom much easier. Find a product everyone needs, monopolize its production, and enjoy the revenue. The Ptolemies applied this strategy to multiple industries. Vegetable oil was another state monopoly, as were various luxury goods, but papyrus was particularly important because it was both essential and difficult to produce elsewhere. The commercial importance of Alexandria attracted not just merchants, but also craftsmen, artisans, and manufacturers. If you're a glass blower, a metal worker, a textile producer, why not work in a city where you have access to raw materials from around the world and customers with money to spend? The city developed industrial districts where various crafts clustered together. Potters near potters, metal workers near metal workers, following the logic that similar businesses benefit from proximity. These weren't factories in the modern sense, but they were production centres, places where skilled labour transformed raw materials into finished goods for local use or export. The economic diversity of Alexandria meant that the city wasn't solely dependent on trade. It also produced goods, which added value and created employment. Housing in Alexandria varied dramatically based on wealth and social status. Elite Greeks lived in large houses with interior courtyards, often decorated with mosaics and painted plaster, sometimes with private bathing facilities. These were comfortable urban residences by any standard. The middle classes, merchants, skilled craftsmen, lower-level officials, lived in smaller but still decent multi-room houses or apartments. The working poor lived in tenements, multi-story apartment buildings that housed many families in cramped conditions. These tenements were built cheaply and densely, and they were notoriously prone to collapse, fire, and general structural failure. Living in an ancient tenement was not recommended if you had any other options, though for many people, there weren't other options. The rich parts of town and the poor parts of town might be only a few blocks apart physically, but they were worlds apart in terms of living conditions. Fire was a constant urban hazard. Most buildings had significant amounts of wood in their construction. Lighting came from oil lamps with open flames, and firefighting technology was rudimentary at best. A fire in a densely built neighbourhood could spread rapidly, destroying whole blocks before it could be contained. Alexandria experienced major fires multiple times throughout its history, the most famous being the fire associated with Julius Caesar's visit in 48 BCE, which we'll get to eventually, but there were surely many smaller fires that destroyed neighbourhoods without making it into the historical record. Urban living in the ancient world meant accepting certain risks that modern building codes and fire departments have largely eliminated. The street life of Alexandria must have been remarkable. You'd have merchants hawking their wares, porters carrying goods, slaves running errands for their owners, scholars debating philosophy, priests performing public rituals, sailors on leave looking for entertainment, pickpockets looking for targets, street performers looking for tips. The noise would be constant, conversation in multiple languages, animals, workshop sounds, street vendors shouting, music from taverns. The smell would be a mix of spices, fish, human sweat, animal dung, smoke from cooking fires and workshops, salt air from the harbour. Walking through ancient Alexandria would be an assault on the senses, in both positive and negative ways. Those romantic visions of ancient cities that show up in movies, with clean streets and good lighting and personal space, bear very little resemblance to the reality. Let's acknowledge the slavery issue, because it was ubiquitous in the ancient world, and Alexandria was no exception. Slaves worked in households, in workshops, in the docks, in agriculture. Everywhere labour was needed. Some slaves were treated relatively well, some appallingly. Some were able to earn money and eventually buy their freedom, Others had no such prospects. The intellectual achievements that Alexandria would become famous for, the library, the museum, the scholarship, were built on an economic foundation that included slave labour. This doesn't mean we shouldn't admire those achievements, but it does mean we should recognise the full context in which they occurred. The ancient world was not a pleasant place for most people most of the time, and the prosperity that made Alexandria possible came at a human cost that tends to get glossed over in accounts focused on cultural and intellectual achievements. Women in Alexandria had somewhat more freedom than in some other ancient Greek cities, but somewhat more still meant very restricted by modern standards. Elite women could own property, conduct some business, and participate in religious life. They also could be educated, at least in some cases, which would eventually produce a few female scholars associated with Alexandria. But social expectations were that women should remain largely within the household sphere, managing domestic affairs while men handled public and political matters. Lower-class women obviously couldn't afford such strict seclusion. If your family needed income, you worked, regardless of gender. But that didn't translate into anything like social equality. The ancient world was deeply patriarchal across cultures, and Alexandria, despite its cosmopolitan character, was no exception to that pattern. The military presence in Alexandria was significant. The Ptolemies maintained a standing army and navy, both of which required facilities, training grounds, weapons storage, and all the other infrastructure of military power. The city had barracks, arsenals, parade grounds. Military parades and public displays of military might were part of the regular calendar of public events, serving both as entertainment and as reminders of the power backing the Ptolemaic state. The soldiers themselves were a diverse group: Macedonian Greeks, Greek mercenaries, native Egyptians, and various other ethnic groups, all serving in different units with different status levels. The military was both a job market and a social institution, providing employment and a path to citizenship for those who served. Religion in Alexandria was complicated because you had multiple religious traditions coexisting: Greek polytheism, Egyptian polytheism, Judaism, and later Christianity and others. The Ptolemies attempted to create some religious unity through syncretism, most famously with the cult of Serapis, which we'll discuss more later. But the basic pattern was that different communities worshipped different gods in different ways, and as long as this didn't threaten public order, the authorities generally tolerated it. There were Greek temples, Egyptian temples, synagogues, all operating in the same city. Religious festivals were important social events, providing entertainment, social cohesion, and occasional days off from work. The Ptolemies sponsored lavish religious festivals, both Greek and Egyptian, as part of their strategy for maintaining legitimacy with different populations. Let's talk about Alexandria's relationship with the rest of Egypt, because it's important to understand that Alexandria was never quite Egyptian, in the way Memphis or Thebes were Egyptian. Alexandria was built as a Greek city that happened to be in Egypt, a colonial settlement designed to extract and redistribute Egyptian wealth for the benefit of a Macedonian Greek ruling class. Native Egyptians weren't barred from the city, but they also weren't full participants in its political life. Citizenship in Alexandria was a Greek citizenship, following Greek models and conferring Greek-style political rights. This created a permanent tension between the Greek-speaking urban elite and the Egyptian-speaking population, both in the city and in the countryside. The Ptolemies ruled as both Greek kings and Egyptian pharaohs, trying to maintain legitimacy in both traditions simultaneously. This balancing act worked reasonably well for a couple of centuries, but the underlying tensions never fully disappeared. The countryside beyond Alexandria, the Egyptian Chora, as the Greeks called it, was where the wealth ultimately came from. Farmers working the land, craftsmen in villages, priests in provincial temples, they were the base of the economic pyramid that supported Alexandria's splendour. The relationship between city and countryside was extractive by design. The state collected taxes, the state controlled grain surpluses, the state directed economic activity. From the perspective of someone farming wheat in the Nile Delta, Alexandria was where your grain went and your taxes went, the place that took and rarely gave back. This created resentments that occasionally flared into open rebellion, particularly during periods of weak central authority or economic stress. The canals connecting Lake Mareotis to the Nile required constant maintenance. Silt accumulates, embankments erode, water levels change. There were entire bureaucratic departments dedicated to canal maintenance, staffed by engineers, surveyors, and thousands of labourers who spent their working lives keeping the waterways functional. This wasn't glamorous work, but without it, Alexandria's water supply and its connection to the Nilotic interior would have failed. The maintenance of infrastructure was a constant drain on the state treasury, one of those necessary expenditures that doesn't produce obvious immediate results, but whose neglect leads to catastrophic long-term consequences. The Ptolemies generally invested in this kind of maintenance early in their dynasty, but as the dynasty aged and priorities shifted, maintenance spending became an easy target for cuts, with predictable results. The climate of Alexandria was and is Mediterranean, which meant hot, dry summers and mild, somewhat wetter winters. By quote, _12 we mean it might actually rain occasionally, though this being Egypt, annual rainfall was still minimal by most standards. Summer temperatures could be quite high, but the sea breeze provided some relief. Winter was genuinely pleasant, mild enough that you didn't need heating but cool enough to be comfortable. The lack of rainfall meant that water supply was always a concern, but it also meant fewer problems with mud, mould, and the various issues that plague cities in wetter climates. On balance, Alexandria's climate was one of its assets, making year-round habitation and commerce relatively easy compared to more extreme climates. Food supply for the city was a major logistical challenge. You had hundreds of thousands of people concentrated in an area that produced minimal food itself. The narrow coastal strip wasn't suitable for large-scale agriculture. Everything had to be imported, primarily from the Nile Delta and Valley. Grain was the foundation of the diet, supplemented by vegetables, fruit, fish, and for those who could afford it, meat. The distribution system had to be robust enough to prevent food shortages, which could lead rapidly to social unrest. The Ptolemies subsidized grain prices for the urban population, following a pattern established by Greek city-states and later perfected by Rome. Keeping the urban masses fed and reasonably content was basic political survival strategy, and the grain supply was too important to be left entirely to market forces. Markets operated on different levels. There were high-end markets where expensive imported goods were sold. Spices from Arabia, silk from the East, metalwork, jewellery, fine pottery. There were middle markets for everyday goods, tools, textiles, household items, and there were low-end markets and street vendors serving the working poor with the cheapest available food and necessities. Price regulation was a constant concern for the authorities because price spikes in basic commodities could trigger riots. The economic complexity of feeding and supplying a major city created opportunities for middlemen, speculators, and merchants, but it also required government oversight to prevent the kind of market manipulation that could destabilize the entire system. The legal system in Alexandria was complex because different populations followed different legal traditions. Greeks resolved disputes according to Greek law, Egyptians according to Egyptian law, Jews according to Jewish law. There were courts for each system, and disputes between members of different communities required some mechanism for deciding which legal framework applied. This legal pluralism was practical given the city's diversity, but it also created ambiguities and opportunities for forum shopping. If you were involved in a dispute, you might try to get it heard in whichever legal system seemed most favourable to your interests. The authorities tried to maintain clear jurisdictional rules, but the reality was messier than the official structure suggested. Infrastructure maintenance extended beyond just canals and harbours. Roads needed repair, buildings needed upkeep, the water system required constant attention, sewers had to be cleaned. The state employed or contracted with workers to handle these tasks, creating a substantial category of public works employment. This was infrastructure as jobs program, centuries before modern governments discovered fiscal stimulus. The work itself was often unpleasant and sometimes dangerous, but it was employment, and in a world without social safety nets, employment meant survival. The urban poor depended heavily on this kind of public works labour, making infrastructure spending not just a technical necessity, but also a social stabilisation mechanism. By the end of the 3rd century BCE, maybe a generation or two after the city's founding, Alexandria had established itself as one of the major cities of the Mediterranean world. It wasn't the largest, Rome would eventually surpass it significantly, but it was absolutely in the top tier in terms of wealth, population, and cultural importance. The physical infrastructure that made this possible, the harbours, the heptastadion, the lighthouse, the grid layout, the water system, the canal connections to the Nile, represented a massive investment in urban engineering. This wasn't accidental. The city was designed intentionally as a capital, a trading hub, and a symbol of Ptolemaic power. The fact that it worked, that it became what its founders intended, was a testament to both Greek urban planning capability and the wealth of Egypt that made the entire project possible. One last observation about the city's founding. Alexander himself never saw Alexandria as a functioning city. He marked out the site, perhaps sketched some basic plans, assigned Xenocrates to work out the details, and then left to continue his conquest of the Persian Empire. He died in Babylon in 323 BCE, probably never knowing that the city bearing his name would become one of the most important urban centres in the ancient world. His body was eventually brought to Alexandria and placed in a tomb somewhere in the royal quarter. Historians still argue about the exact location, where it became a pilgrimage site and a symbol of the city's connection to its legendary founder. So Alexander got to be present in Alexandria after all, just not in the way he originally intended. The city he named but never knew would house his corpse and build its reputation on the legacy of his conquests. Not exactly the most conventional founder story, but fitting for a city that itself was never quite conventional. Now that we've established how Alexandria became a physical hub, we need to talk about how Ptolemy I turned that hub into a functioning kingdom, because having excellent harbour infrastructure is great, but it doesn't automatically translate into political legitimacy or cultural authority. Ptolemy had a problem that many conquerors throughout history have faced. He'd seized control of Egypt through a combination of military force, political manoeuvring, and being in the right place when Alexander's empire fractured. But military conquest doesn't automatically make people accept your rule, especially when you're a Macedonian Greek trying to govern a population that's been Egyptian for thousands of years and has very specific ideas about what makes a legitimate ruler. Ptolemy's solution was essentially to be two different rulers simultaneously. To the Greek population of Alexandria and the Greek settlers throughout Egypt, he presented himself as a Hellenistic monarch, a successor to Alexander, a Basilius in the Greek tradition. To the native Egyptian population, he presented himself as a pharaoh, a divine ruler in the ancient Egyptian tradition, complete with all the ritual and iconography that came with that role. This wasn't just cynical political theatre, though it was definitely that. It was also a practical acknowledgement that different populations needed different forms of legitimacy. The Greeks didn't care about pharaonic traditions, and the Egyptians didn't particularly care about Macedonian military glory. So Ptolemy gave each group what they wanted, or at least what they needed to see in order to accept his rule. The double legitimacy strategy required Ptolemy to participate in two completely different political and religious systems. On the Greek side, this meant maintaining a court culture that looked appropriately Hellenistic. Greek language, Greek advisors, Greek philosophical and artistic patronage, Greek military organization. On the Egyptian side, this meant supporting traditional Egyptian temples, participating in Egyptian religious rituals, building in traditional Egyptian architectural styles, and generally performing the role of pharaoh in ways that Egyptian priests and elites would recognize as legitimate. This was not a small-time commitment. Egyptian religious ceremonies could be elaborate and time-consuming, requiring the ruler's presence or at least his official participation through proxies. The visual propaganda supporting this dual identity was everywhere. In Alexandria and other Greek cities, Ptolemy appeared on coins as a Hellenistic king, with Greek inscriptions and Greek iconography. In Egyptian temples, he appeared in reliefs and statues as a traditional pharaoh, wearing the double crown, making offerings to Egyptian gods, accompanied by hieroglyphic inscriptions proclaiming his devotion to Egyptian tradition. The same person, two completely different presentations depending on the audience. It's the ancient equivalent of having different social media profiles for different friend groups, except with significantly higher stakes and more elaborate costume changes. The coinage deserves special mention because Ptolemy understood that money is both economics and propaganda. The Ptolemaic currency system was stable, abundant, and featured the ruler's image on virtually every coin. This wasn't just vanity, though it was certainly also vanity. Every financial transaction reinforced who was in charge. Every merchant handling Ptolemaic coins was reminded of Ptolemaic authority. Every soldier paid in Ptolemaic currency understood who signed their paycheck. The coins were high quality, with reliable weight and purity, which meant people trusted them. A trusted currency is an incredibly powerful tool of state control, because it allows the government to tax effectively, pay its employees reliably, and conduct international trade on favourable terms. Ptolemy wasn't the first ruler to understand this, but he executed the strategy particularly well. The grain economy was the foundation of everything else. Egypt's agricultural surplus was legendary in the ancient world. The Nile's annual flood deposited fresh soil across the floodplain, making Egypt one of the most productive agricultural regions anywhere. The Ptolemies turned this natural advantage into a state monopoly. The government controlled grain collection, storage, and distribution. Farmers were required to sell their surplus to the state at fixed prices. The state then resold that grain, both domestically and internationally, at whatever price the market would bear. The profit margin on this operation was substantial, and it funded basically everything else the Ptolemaic state did: the military, the administration, the building projects, and eventually the museum and library. This system was exploitative by design. From the perspective of an Egyptian farmer, you worked your land, the Nile flooded and made your fields productive, and then the state showed up to collect most of your surplus at prices you didn't get to negotiate. The Ptolemies justified this by pointing to the infrastructure they provided: irrigation, maintenance, protection from foreign invasion, law and order. But the basic relationship was extractive. The wealth of Alexandria was built on the agricultural labour of the Egyptian countryside, a fact that created ongoing tensions between the Greek urban elite and the Egyptian rural population. These tensions would periodically explode into open rebellion, particularly when the Ptolemaic state showed signs of weakness. But let's talk about Ptolemy's most innovative move in terms of cultural infrastructure: the invention of Serapis. This is one of the stranger episodes in ancient religious history, and it demonstrates both the flexibility of ancient religious practice and the degree to which religion could be deliberately manipulated for political purposes. Ptolemy, probably with the advice of Egyptian priests and Greek advisors, essentially created a new god designed to bridge the cultural gap between Greeks and Egyptians. Serapis, the name itself is apparently a fusion of Osiris and Apis, two important Egyptian deities, was presented as a supreme deity who combined Egyptian and Greek characteristics in one conveniently syncretic package. The genius of Serapis was that he could be understood in different ways by different populations. To Greeks, Serapis looked like a Hellenistic god, often depicted in a style similar to Zeus, associated with the underworld like Hades, linked to healing like Asclepius. Greek settlers could worship Serapis without feeling like they were abandoning their cultural identity. To Egyptians, Serapis maintained connections to traditional Egyptian deities, particularly Osiris and Apis, allowing Egyptian worshippers to see him as a continuation of their religious traditions rather than a foreign imposition. The cult of Serapis provided a religious middle ground where Greeks and Egyptians could worship side by side, which was politically invaluable in a city as diverse as Alexandria. The main temple of Serapis, the Serapeum, was built on a hill in the western part of Alexandria, and it became one of the city's most important religious and cultural centres. The temple complex wasn't just a place of worship, it included libraries, meeting halls, lecture spaces, and archives. It functioned as a sort of community centre for intellectual and religious life, a place where philosophers could debate, scholars could study, and ordinary people could participate in religious festivals. The Serapeum would eventually become almost as important to Alexandria's intellectual life as the main library in the royal quarter, serving as a secondary hub for scholarship and learning. We'll come back to the Serapeum later when discussing the library's eventual fate, but for now, the important point is that Ptolemy understood that creating shared religious institutions could help bridge cultural divides. Religious syncretism wasn't unique to Alexandria. It was a common strategy throughout the Hellenistic world, where Greek culture encountered and merged with local traditions. But the Ptolemies pursued it more systematically than most. Beyond Serapis, they supported traditional Egyptian cults, patronized major temples like those at Karnak and Edfu, and generally maintained the infrastructure of Egyptian religious life. This wasn't purely cynical. Some Ptolemaic rulers seem to have genuinely participated in Egyptian religious practices, but it was certainly strategic. Supporting Egyptian temples meant maintaining good relationships with the Egyptian priestly class, who exercised considerable influence over the rural population. The priests could legitimize Ptolemaic rule, or they could undermine it, so keeping them satisfied was basic political prudence. The economic policies supporting all of this were sophisticated for the era. The Ptolemies didn't just tax agricultural production, they monopolized various industries and commodities. Vegetable oil production was a state monopoly. Papyrus production was a state monopoly. Beer production was heavily regulated and taxed. Salt was a state monopoly. The government controlled banking and currency exchange. This level of economic intervention would make modern free market economists nervous, but in the context of the ancient world, it was effective statecraft. Monopolies generated revenue, prevented economic power from accumulating in private hands that might challenge royal authority, and allowed the state to control prices of essential commodities. The bureaucracy required to administer this system was extensive. The Ptolemies developed one of the most sophisticated administrative apparatuses in the ancient world, with hierarchies of officials managing everything from tax collection to irrigation maintenance to legal disputes. These officials were paid salaries by the state, which meant their loyalty was theoretically to the crown rather than to local populations or private interests. In practice, corruption was endemic. Officials on the ground had numerous opportunities to skim from tax revenues, demand bribes, or otherwise profit from their positions. The central government tried to control this through inspections, audits, and rotating assignments. But corruption in ancient bureaucracies was about as common as corruption in modern bureaucracies, which is to say, very common indeed. Documentation was crucial to making this system work. The Ptolemaic bureaucracy generated enormous quantities of written records, tax receipts, contracts, administrative orders, census data, legal judgments. Everything that could be written down was written down, usually in multiple copies. This created employment for scribes, who formed a substantial professional class in Ptolemaic Egypt. It also created a paper trail that historians find incredibly valuable, because unlike most ancient states, whose administrative records have mostly vanished, Ptolemaic Egypt's dry climate preserved papyrus documents that give us detailed insight into how the system actually functioned. We can read tax receipts from small villages, contracts between individual farmers, petitions to local officials. The mundane paperwork of ancient administration survived in ways that allow us to reconstruct the system in remarkable detail. Now, all of this political and economic infrastructure was necessary context for understanding the museum, because the museum didn't exist in isolation. It was part of the broader Ptolemaic project of establishing Alexandria as a cultural capital, and it was funded by the surplus generated by the economic system we've just described. The museum, or Mouseion in Greek, literally shrine to the muses, was essentially the world's first state-funded research institute. This was Ptolemy's other great innovation beyond harbour construction and religious syncretism. The idea that a government should pay scholars to pursue knowledge for its own sake, with no immediate practical application required. The concept had precedents. Greek philosophical schools like Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum had brought together students and teachers for collective learning, but those institutions were privately funded, dependent on wealthy patrons or student fees. The museum was different because it was a royal foundation, funded directly from the state treasury, with scholars receiving regular stipends that allowed them to pursue research without worrying about economic survival. This was the ancient equivalent of tenure-track academic employment, except probably with better weather and worse dental care. The museum was located within the royal quarter, which meant it was both privileged and controlled. Scholars working at the museum had access to royal patronage, proximity to the library, interaction with other leading intellectuals, and residence in the most desirable part of Alexandria. They also worked under the watchful eye of the Ptolemaic court, which meant their research might be impressive, but their politics had to be careful. The museum was not a place for open dissent against royal authority. You were there on the king's dime, living in the king's city, using the king's library, and the king's patience for criticism was limited. This created a certain dynamic where scholarship was encouraged but political engagement was risky. The physical layout of the museum was designed to facilitate intellectual community. There were lecture halls where scholars could present their work to each other. There were covered walkways, peripetos in Greek, where philosophers could stroll while discussing ideas, following Aristotle's model. There were dining halls where members ate together at state expense, following the Greek symposium tradition of combining meals with intellectual conversation. There were gardens for contemplation, observatories for astronomical work, anatomical theatres for medical research, workshops for engineering and mathematical models. The entire complex was designed as a space where intellectual work could flourish. The common meals were particularly important to the museum's social structure. Scholars of different specializations ate together, which meant a mathematician might find himself dining with a poet, a geographer with a medical researcher, a grammarian with an astronomer. This cross-pollination of ideas was deliberate. The Ptolemies understood that innovation often comes from unexpected connections between different fields, from conversations where someone's expertise in one area suggests new approaches to problems in another area. So they created an institutional structure that forced these conversations to happen regularly. You couldn't just hide in your study. You had to show up for communal meals, where you'd inevitably end up discussing your work with colleagues who might have completely different perspectives. The stipend system meant scholars didn't have to teach to support themselves, which was revolutionary. In traditional Greek education, philosophers and scholars supported themselves by taking students who paid fees. This meant your time was divided between your own research and the teaching necessary to fund that research. Museum scholars were freed from this constraint. They could focus entirely on their own work. They might choose to teach, many did, taking on students who wanted to learn from them, but teaching was optional rather than economically necessary. This was academic freedom in a very literal sense, freedom from economic pressure, freedom to pursue questions that might not have immediate practical value or broad popular appeal. Of course, this freedom came with strings attached. The museum was a royal institution, and the scholars were royal employees. Appointments were made by the crown or by officials acting on the crown's behalf. Continued employment depended on royal favour, which could be withdrawn for various reasons: political disagreement, personality conflicts, budget cuts, court intrigue. The museum's scholarly culture was therefore always somewhat cautious, always aware that their comfortable situation depended on maintaining good relationships with the ruling dynasty. When the Ptolemaic court was stable and well-funded, the museum thrived. When the court was factional and violent, as it periodically was, museum scholars sometimes found themselves caught up in purges and power struggles that had nothing to do with their actual research. The library was technically separate from the museum, but functionally intertwined with it. Museum scholars had privileged access to the library's collections, which was one of the main attractions of working at the museum. If you were a scholar in the 3rd century BCE, you had two choices. You could work independently, relying on whatever texts you could personally acquire, or you could work at Alexandria with access to the largest collection of texts in the world. This was not a difficult choice for most ambitious scholars. The library's resources made research possible that simply couldn't be done anywhere else. Comparative textual analysis, comprehensive surveys of literature on a given topic, detailed historical research, all of this required access to large numbers of texts, and only Alexandria could provide that access. The museum attracted leading scholars from across the Greek world. Euclid, who wrote the elements that would define geometry education for 2 millennia, worked at Alexandria during the reign of Ptolemy I. Archimedes, probably the greatest mathematician and engineer of antiquity, studied at Alexandria, though he spent most of his career in Syracuse. Eratosthenes, who calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, directed the library and worked at the museum. Herophilus and Erasistratus revolutionized medicine through human dissection, work they conducted at Alexandria, where legal and social constraints on anatomical research were apparently more relaxed than elsewhere. Apollonius of Rhodes wrote his epic poem The Argonautica while working at the museum. These weren't isolated geniuses working in garrets. They were salaried employees of a government research institute, funded by grain taxes and royal patronage. The scholarly community was international in a way that was unusual for the ancient world. Scholars came from all over the Greek-speaking Mediterranean, from mainland Greece, the islands, Asia Minor, Sicily, even further afield. This concentration of talent created a critical mass of expertise that reinforced itself. Young scholars came to Alexandria to study with established scholars. Some stayed to pursue their own research, and the most successful might eventually gain positions at the museum themselves. This created a self-perpetuating cycle of scholarly excellence, at least for the first century or so of the institution's existence. The fields of study pursued at the museum were diverse. Mathematics and geometry were major focuses. Euclid's systematization of geometry, Apollonius's work on conic sections, later scholars' work on arithmetic and number theory. Astronomy and geography attracted significant attention. Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's size, Hipparchus later catalogued stars and developed trigonometry. Others mapped the known world with increasing accuracy. Medicine advanced dramatically through anatomical research and clinical observation. Engineering and mechanics flourished. Ctesibius invented the force pump and improved water clocks. Hero of Alexandria later created various mechanical devices, including early steam-powered toys. Literary scholarship, which we'll discuss more later, was perhaps the museum's most distinctive contribution. The systematic study of texts, the development of critical methods for establishing authentic versions of literary works. The observatories at the museum were apparently quite sophisticated for the era. Astronomical observation required instruments for measuring celestial positions, star catalogues for reference, mathematical models for predicting planetary motions. The scholars at Alexandria had access to Babylonian astronomical records through the scholarly networks of the Hellenistic world, which gave them centuries of observational data to work with. They combined this data with Greek geometric models of celestial motion, creating increasingly accurate predictive systems. The result was astronomy that was both mathematically sophisticated and empirically grounded, a combination that wouldn't be systematically improved until the scientific revolution nearly 2,000 years later. Medical research at Alexandria was particularly noteworthy because it included human dissection, which was rare in the ancient world due to religious and cultural prohibitions. Herophilus and Erasistratus, working in the early 3rd century BCE, conducted systematic dissections and made major discoveries about anatomy. Herophilus identified the brain as the centre of the nervous system, distinguished sensory and motor nerves, described the anatomy of the eye and the reproductive system, measured pulse rates. Erasistratus studied the circulatory system, distinguished between veins and arteries, and developed theories about how blood and pneuma, air or vital spirit, move through the body. Their work was based on direct observation of human anatomy, which gave them insights that purely theoretical medicine couldn't achieve. There were later accusations that Herophilus and Erasistratus practiced vivisection on condemned criminals, dissecting living people to observe physiological processes in action. These accusations come from sources writing centuries after the fact, so they're historically questionable, but they were apparently credible enough to be repeated by multiple ancient authors. If true, this would represent a rather extreme application of the principle that the pursuit of knowledge justifies significant ethical costs. If false, it's a good reminder that even in antiquity, people told horror stories about what scientists might be doing behind closed doors. Either way, the anatomical knowledge produced at Alexandria was real and valuable, even if the methods of acquiring that knowledge might have been ethically problematic. The engineering work at the museum combined theoretical mathematics with practical applications. Ctesibius, who worked during the 3rd century BCE, invented various mechanical devices including improved water clocks that used elaborate systems of gears and floats to measure time with unprecedented accuracy. These weren't just clever toys. Accurate timekeeping was important for astronomy, for coordinating activities, for various practical purposes. Ctesibius also invented the force pump, which had applications in firefighting, mining, and hydraulic organs. His student Philo of Byzantium wrote treatises on mechanics, pneumatics, and military engineering, combining theoretical principles with detailed practical instructions. Hero of Alexandria, who worked much later, probably in the 1st century CE, represents the culmination of this engineering tradition. His works describe various mechanical devices, a steam-powered rotating sphere that's sometimes called the first steam engine, automatic doors for temples that opened when a fire was lit on an altar, various theatrical mechanisms and automata. Some of these were purely demonstrative, showing principles of pneumatics and mechanics without having practical applications. Others had real uses. His treatise on surveying described instruments and methods that were actually employed in land measurement. The museum's engineering tradition shows that ancient scholars didn't see a sharp distinction between pure and applied research. Mathematics informed mechanics, mechanics demonstrated mathematical principles, and both contributed to a broader understanding of how the world worked. The interdisciplinary nature of museum scholarship meant that advances in one field often informed work in other fields. Geometric techniques developed by mathematicians were applied to astronomical problems by astronomers. Anatomical knowledge from medical research informed philosophical discussions about the nature of perception and consciousness. Geographic surveys required mathematical methods for calculating distances and positions. Literary scholars used historical knowledge to contextualize texts, while historians used literary texts as sources. This wasn't modern interdisciplinary collaboration exactly, but it was a scholarly environment where different fields of knowledge were in conversation with each other. The museum's workshops produced not just theoretical knowledge, but also physical objects, scientific instruments, mechanical models, anatomical illustrations, astronomical charts, maps. These objects were themselves forms of knowledge, embodying understanding in material form. A working model of a pump demonstrated principles of hydraulics more effectively than abstract description. An anatomical diagram preserved medical knowledge in visual form. A properly calibrated astrolabe allowed practical astronomical measurements. The museum was engaged in what we might call material scholarship, creating objects that captured and transmitted knowledge alongside written texts. Let's talk about the daily rhythms of life at the museum, because it wasn't all groundbreaking discoveries and intellectual breakthroughs. Most days involved routine scholarly work, reading texts, taking notes, conducting observations, building apparatus, having conversations with colleagues, writing up results. Scholars had private rooms or small apartments within the museum complex where they could work and live. They had access to the library at specified times. They participated in communal meals. They attended lectures and presentations by their colleagues. They presumably dealt with the same kinds of institutional politics and interpersonal tensions that characterize any academic community: disagreements over credit for ideas, personality conflicts, competition for status and resources. The social hierarchy within the museum was probably complex. There were senior scholars with established reputations, mid-career scholars building their credentials, younger scholars just starting out. There were scholars who focused on teaching and had students, scholars who worked independently, scholars who collaborated with others. The director of the library held a particularly prestigious position, essentially serving as the chief intellectual officer of the Ptolemaic state. This position went to prominent scholars like Zenodotus, Apollonius of Rhodes, Eratosthenes, and Aristophanes of Byzantium. Being appointed library director was both an honour and a burden. You gained authority and prestige, but you also took on administrative responsibilities that might interfere with your own research. Funding for the museum came from the royal treasury, which meant it was subject to the usual uncertainties of government finance. When the kingdom was wealthy, and the rulers were generous toward intellectual pursuits, the museum flourished. When royal finances were strained or when rulers had other priorities, the museum's budget might be cut. There's evidence that later in the Ptolemaic period, funding became less reliable, and some scholars left for other opportunities. The museum's golden age was roughly the 3rd century BCE, under the first 3 or 4 Ptolemaic rulers, when money was abundant and intellectual patronage was a royal priority. Later centuries saw decline, not necessarily in the quality of scholarship but in the resources available and the number of scholars supported. The relationship between the museum and the broader city of Alexandria was somewhat ambiguous. Museum scholars were privileged residents of the royal quarter, set apart from ordinary urban life by walls and guards. They didn't pay taxes, they were exempt as royal employees, they had guaranteed food and housing, they had access to resources unavailable to others. This created a certain separation between the intellectual elite and the general population. Museum scholars weren't exactly cloistered. They could move through the city, attend public events, interact with non-scholars, but they were definitely a separate social category, identifiable by their association with the royal court and the museum. Some scholars apparently engaged with public audiences, giving lectures or demonstrations outside the museum complex. The Ptolemies periodically sponsored public festivals that included intellectual competitions, poetry contests, mathematical challenges, rhetorical displays. These events brought scholarship out of the museum and into the broader civic life of Alexandria. They also reinforced the Ptolemies' image as patrons of culture and learning, demonstrating that royal taxation was producing not just military power, but also cultural achievements that brought glory to the city and the kingdom. The museum's library resources weren't just the main library in the royal quarter. Scholars apparently had smaller collections of reference works in the museum itself, and there was the secondary library at the Serapeum that became increasingly important over time. Museum scholars could request specific texts from the main library, which would be retrieved and brought to them, or they could visit the library to consult materials directly. There was apparently a system for managing these requests and ensuring that valuable texts weren't lost or damaged. Given that every book was a unique manuscript or a laboriously created copy, the loss of a text was potentially the permanent loss of knowledge, so the libraries had to balance access with preservation. The writing materials used by museum scholars were primarily papyrus for everyday notes and drafts, with parchment used for more permanent records. Ink was made from various substances: carbon black mixed with gum for normal writing, red ochre for special markings. Writing implements were reed pens, cut and shaped to hold ink and create consistent lines. Scholars would write on papyrus scrolls, which unrolled horizontally, with text in columns running parallel to the scroll's length. This format influenced writing style. You couldn't easily flip back and forth between different sections of a text the way you can with a modern book, which meant that works were organized to be read linearly, with important information often summarized at the beginning. Mistakes were inevitable in this writing system, and corrections required either scraping away the incorrect text and rewriting, or marking corrections between lines or in margins. Rough drafts were genuinely rough. Crossed-out words, marginal notes, sections marked for reordering. Final copies were cleaner but still handwritten, which meant variations and errors accumulated with each copying. Museum scholars dealing with older texts had to compare multiple copies to try to establish what the original author actually wrote, distinguishing between intentional variants and copying errors. This textual criticism, which we'll discuss more when we get to the library proper, was a major focus of scholarly work at the museum. The working day at the museum probably followed the typical ancient pattern: rising at dawn, working during the morning when light was good, a break during the hottest part of the day, resuming work in the afternoon, stopping when daylight faded. Artificial lighting existed but was expensive and not great for extended reading or writing, so most intellectual work happened during daylight hours. The common evening meal would be after sunset, followed by social time and then sleep. This rhythm was dictated by natural light rather than by electric lighting or strict schedules, which meant that work patterns varied somewhat with the seasons. Leisure time for museum scholars might include walking in the gardens, conversations with colleagues, attendance at theatrical performances or athletic competitions, visits to other parts of the city, reading for pleasure rather than research. The museum wasn't a monastery. Scholars weren't expected to dedicate every waking moment to intellectual work, but the assumption was that you were there to pursue knowledge, and a scholar who spent too much time on leisure and not enough on productive work might find their position questioned when appointments were reviewed. The museum's reputation attracted not just scholars, but also students who wanted to learn from the best minds of the age. These students weren't necessarily museum members. They were more like visiting scholars or apprentices, paying their own way while studying with established scholars. Some would eventually gain positions at the museum themselves. Others would return to their home cities carrying knowledge and methods learned at Alexandria. This educational function, though secondary to research, was important for spreading Alexandrian intellectual culture throughout the Greek world. Students who studied at Alexandria often became teachers elsewhere, creating networks of intellectual influence that extended the museum's impact far beyond Alexandria's walls. Let's acknowledge the gender issue. The museum was overwhelmingly male. Ancient Greek intellectual culture was deeply patriarchal, and the museum reflected that. There were occasional exceptions. Hypatia, a mathematician and philosopher, would work at Alexandria in the 4th century CE, though that was long after the museum's peak, and she was associated more with the city's broader intellectual community than with the museum as an institution. But for the most part, the museum was a men's club, reflecting the broader social restrictions that limited women's access to education and public intellectual life. This doesn't mean women weren't intellectual or weren't interested in learning. It means they were systematically excluded from institutional opportunities. The slaves and servants who maintained the museum complex, cleaning, cooking, delivering messages, maintaining gardens, all the practical work necessary to keep the institution functioning, were invisible in most ancient accounts, which focus on the scholars and their achievements. But the museum's operation depended on this support labour. Scholars could focus on research because someone else was handling daily necessities. The common meals appeared because someone cooked them. The gardens stayed pleasant because someone tended them. Buildings stayed maintained because craftsmen repaired them. This invisible labour made the visible intellectual work possible, a pattern that's remained consistent in academic institutions throughout history. Competition among scholars was probably significant, though usually polite. Academic rivalry is not a modern invention. Scholars competed for prestige, for credit for discoveries, for the attention and approval of royal patrons, for positions of authority within the museum. Some of this competition was productive, driving scholars to work harder and achieve more. Some was probably petty and personal. Ancient sources occasionally mention scholarly feuds, disputes over priority, accusations of plagiarism or incompetence. Human nature doesn't change much across centuries, and putting a bunch of ambitious, intelligent people in close proximity tends to generate both collaboration and competition. The museum's success as an institution depended on maintaining a critical mass of talented people. As long as working at the museum meant joining a community of leading scholars with access to unparalleled resources, the museum could attract top talent. When that began to change, when funding became uncertain, when political instability affected the royal quarter, when alternative opportunities appeared elsewhere, the museum's ability to attract and retain scholars declined. This process took centuries, but it was probably inevitable. No institution maintains its peak status forever. What's remarkable is how long the museum remained a premier intellectual centre and how much knowledge was produced during its peak centuries. One last observation about the museum's place in the Ptolemaic system: it was both genuine intellectual patronage and also a form of soft power. Supporting scholars and producing knowledge brought prestige to the Ptolemaic dynasty. When Euclid's Elements spread throughout the Mediterranean world, it carried Alexandria's reputation with it. When Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference, Alexandria got credit for that achievement. The Ptolemies were funding scholarship partly because they valued knowledge, but also because they understood that cultural achievement enhanced their dynasty's standing. This wasn't cynical. The two motivations coexisted comfortably. You could genuinely value learning while also recognizing that supporting learning brought political benefits. The museum represented something new in the ancient world: the idea that governments should fund intellectual work for its own sake, that knowledge production deserved institutional support, that bringing scholars together in a community would generate achievements impossible for isolated individuals. This model wouldn't be fully replicated until much later. Medieval universities had some similar features, modern research universities even more so, but the basic concept originated in Alexandria. The Ptolemies invented the Research Institute, and in doing so, they changed what intellectual work could accomplish. Not bad for a dynasty that started with a Macedonian general seizing control of Egypt amid the collapse of Alexander's empire. Sometimes even conquerors can leave lasting legacies that don't involve bloodshed and destruction. Now we need to talk about how the library actually accumulated its legendary collection, because books don't just magically appear on shelves, and in the ancient world where every text was a handwritten manuscript, building a comprehensive library required aggressive, systematic, and occasionally ethically questionable acquisition strategies. The Ptolemies approached book collecting with the same energy that modern tech companies approach data collection, which is to say, they wanted everything, and they weren't particularly concerned about asking permission first. The library's acquisition operation was essentially an organised book hunting network that spanned the Mediterranean world. At the centre was an official called the Superintendent of the Library. Though ancient sources use various titles for this position, this person coordinated the acquisition efforts, managed the budget for buying texts, oversaw the copying operations, and generally ran what was effectively the ancient world's most ambitious content aggregation project. Under this superintendent were various officials, agents, and scribes whose job was to find texts and get them to Alexandria by whatever means necessary. This wasn't a casual hobby. This was institutional commitment to universal collection, backed by royal funding and authority. The most famous acquisition method, which ancient sources describe with what sounds like a mixture of admiration and horror, was the inspection of ships arriving in Alexandria's harbours. Officials would board merchant vessels and conduct searches for any books or manuscripts on board. When they found texts, whether personal possessions of passengers, cargo being transported for sale, or working copies used by ship captains for navigation, they would confiscate them. The texts would be taken to the library, where scribes would make copies. Then, in what the Ptolemies apparently considered generous behaviour, they would return the copies to the original owners, while keeping the originals for the library's collection. The owners got their text back, technically, just not the actual manuscripts they'd arrived with. This policy had a certain logic to it. From the Ptolemies' perspective, the library needed original manuscripts to produce the most accurate versions of texts, free from the copying errors that accumulated with each generation of manuscript reproduction. Original manuscripts were more valuable for scholarly purposes than copies of copies of copies, so they kept the originals, made high-quality copies to return to the owners, and considered this a fair exchange. From the perspective of someone whose personal copy of Homer got swapped for a fresh copy made by a library scribe, this was probably less appealing. Sure, you got your text back, but you lost whatever marginal notes, personal annotations, or sentimental value your original manuscript held, the ancient equivalent of having your well-worn paperback replaced with a pristine new copy. Technically an upgrade, but not exactly what you wanted. The ship inspections weren't just opportunistic searching. They were systematic policy, which meant there were procedures, documentation, records of what texts were seized, and what copies were returned. The Ptolemies were bureaucratic about their book piracy, which is very on brand for a dynasty that bureaucratized everything else. There was probably a whole department handling ship inspections, with officials assigned to different docks, scribes recording confiscations, supervisors ensuring the system ran smoothly. This wasn't some corrupt harbour officials pocketing interesting books. This was official state policy, implemented systematically, with record-keeping and accountability. Beyond ship inspections, the library sent agents to other cities to purchase texts. These agents had royal funding and instructions to buy significant works regardless of price. If a city had a famous library or a notable private collection, Alexandria's agents would show up offering money for copies or, if possible, for the originals themselves. This was competitive book hunting. Other Hellenistic kingdoms also valued libraries. Pergamum in Asia Minor had a famous library that rivaled Alexandria's, so there was essentially an arms race in book acquisition, with different kingdoms competing to build the most comprehensive collections. Prices for rare texts could be substantial, which was fine because the Ptolemies had substantial budgets, funded by Egypt's agricultural wealth. The copying operation within the library was industrial in scale. Multiple scribes worked simultaneously, often using a method where one person read a text aloud, while several scribes wrote down what they heard. This allowed rapid production of multiple copies from a single original. The downside was that this method introduced errors, misheard words, homophone confusions, missed phrases. Scribes working from visual copying of written texts made different kinds of errors, but probably fewer overall mistakes. The library apparently used both methods depending on circumstances, with visual copying preferred for important texts where accuracy was critical, and vocal copying used when speed mattered more. The scribes doing this work were skilled professionals, trained in clear handwriting and familiar with different literary genres and styles. Copying texts isn't just mechanical transcription. You need to understand what you're copying to recognize when something doesn't make sense, to maintain consistent formatting, to handle abbreviations and conventions. A good scribe was a valuable employee, and the library employed many of them. These weren't scholars, they were craftsmen, specialists in manuscript production. The scholarly work of understanding and analysing text happened after the copying was done, but the copying itself was essential infrastructure for that scholarly work. The physical organisation of the library required systems for storing and retrieving texts. Scrolls were stored in labelled containers, often made of wood or clay, with tags identifying the contents. These tags included the title of the work, the author's name, the number of lines or scrolls if the work spanned multiple rolls, and possibly other information like where the text came from or what edition it was. This tagging system was crucial because scrolls don't have spines with titles visible when they're shelved. You can't just scan a wall of scrolls and spot the text you want. You need labels, and you need those labels to be accurate and informative. The storage spaces themselves were probably long halls with shelving or pigeonholes for scroll containers. There might have been different rooms for different categories of texts, poetry separate from philosophy, medical texts separate from mathematical texts. The largest works, like Homer's epics or the histories of Herodotus, might occupy entire sections because they required multiple scrolls. The smallest works might be grouped together, multiple short texts in a single container. Managing this physical collection required staff who knew where things were, who could retrieve requested texts, who could ensure that borrowed scrolls were returned to the correct locations. Environmental control was a constant concern. Papyrus is organic material, and it's vulnerable to humidity, insects, and mold. Egypt's dry climate helped, but Alexandria was a coastal city with different humidity levels than the desert interior. The library probably had systems for airing out scrolls, rotating them to prevent permanent deformation from storage, checking for insect damage, repairing damaged manuscripts. This preservation work was ongoing and unglamorous, but absolutely essential. A library that doesn't maintain its collection will gradually lose that collection to decay, regardless of how aggressively it acquires new materials. There's a famous story about Ptolemy III borrowing the official state copies of the great Athenian tragedies from Athens, supposedly for the purpose of making copies for the library. Athens, understandably nervous about letting these precious manuscripts leave the city, required a massive deposit, 15 talents of silver, which was an enormous sum. Ptolemy paid the deposit, took the manuscripts to Alexandria, had his scribes make copies, and then returned the copies to Athens while keeping the originals for the library and forfeiting the deposit. Athens got their texts back, technically, plus they kept the deposit money. But Alexandria got the original manuscripts, which was what Ptolemy actually wanted. This story may be apocryphal. Ancient sources sometimes exaggerated the Ptolemy's book obsession, but it's consistent with everything else we know about Alexandria's acquisition strategies. When you want something badly enough, and you have enough money, the financial cost becomes secondary to the goal. Now let's talk about Callimachus and the Pinaques, because acquiring texts is only half the problem. The other half is organising them in ways that make the collection usable. A library with hundreds of thousands of scrolls that nobody can find is just an expensive warehouse. Callimachus, who worked at the library during the 3rd century BCE, created what was essentially the ancient world's first comprehensive bibliography, a systematic catalogue of the library's holdings, organised by subject and author. He called this work the Pinaques, which translates roughly as tablets, or lists, though its full title was something like Tables of Those Who Distinguished Themselves in All Forms of Culture and What They Wrote. The Pinaques was enormous. Ancient sources suggest it ran to 120 books, meaning 120 papyrus scrolls, which would translate to well over 100,000 words of pure bibliography. This wasn't just a list of titles. For each author, Callimachus apparently included biographical information, a list of their works, notes about authenticity and attribution, information about first lines, word counts or line counts, and probably other details that helped identify and locate texts. This was metadata before anyone had invented the concept of metadata, a systematic attempt to impose intellectual order on a massive and growing collection of texts. The organisational scheme Callimachus used was partly by genre and partly by author. The main categories were apparently poetry and prose, with subdivisions under each. Poetry included epic, lyric, tragic, comic, and other forms. Prose included history, philosophy, oratory, medicine, and various technical subjects. Within each category, authors were listed typically in alphabetical order, a practice that was still relatively novel in the ancient world. Alphabetization seems obvious to us, but it requires agreement on what alphabet to use and in what order, and it requires that everyone using the system knows that order. Ancient Greece didn't standardize these practices until relatively late, so Callimachus using alphabetical order was part of creating the system, not just following an established convention. For scholars working at the museum, the Pinaques was an essential tool. If you wanted to know what works a particular author had written, you consulted the Pinaques. If you wanted to find all the texts on a particular subject, you looked in the relevant section. If you wanted to verify whether a text attributed to a famous author was genuine, you checked Callimachus's notes on authenticity. The Pinaques transformed the library from a collection of scrolls into a searchable repository of knowledge, which is fundamentally what makes a library useful rather than just impressive. Creating the Pinaques required Callimachus to examine enormous numbers of texts, verify authorship, gather biographical information about authors, and make judgments about disputed attributions. This wasn't clerical work. This was scholarly work that required deep knowledge of Greek literature and critical judgment about textual questions. Callimachus was himself a respected poet and scholar, not just a cataloguer. The Pinaques was his contribution to literary scholarship, and it shaped how later scholars understood and organised Greek literature. The concept of authorship that the Pinaques reinforced was significant. By organising texts under authors' names and trying to establish authentic canons of individual writers' works, Callimachus promoted the idea that texts had identifiable creators whose other works formed a coherent body of writing worth studying as a unit. This might seem obvious, but in the ancient world texts circulated with varying degrees of attribution, and there wasn't always clear distinction between an author's genuine works and texts falsely attributed to them. Callimachus's work helped establish the principle that authorship matters, that we should care who wrote what, and that libraries should organize materials around these authorial attributions. Now we get to the textual critics, the scholars who took the raw materials of the library's collection and tried to establish accurate versions of important texts. The problem they faced was that every manuscript was hand-copied, and every copying introduced potential errors. A scribe might mishear a word, misread a letter, skip a line, accidentally repeat a passage, or correct something that seemed wrong but was actually what the author wrote. Over multiple generations of copying, errors accumulated. A text copied in the 5th century BCE might, by the 3rd century BCE, exist in multiple versions with significant variations between them. Which version was correct? Which readings represented what the author actually wrote? Zenodotus of Ephesus was apparently the first official head of the library, appointed around 285 BCE, and he was also the first scholar to systematically edit major Greek texts. His most important work was on Homer, producing what's called a recension, a critically established version of the text. Zenodotus had access to many different manuscripts of the Iliad and Odyssey, and he compared them to identify variations. When different manuscripts had different readings, he had to decide which was most likely original. Sometimes he marked lines he considered spurious, later editions that weren't written by Homer, with critical signs in the margins. He apparently removed some lines entirely from his edition, considering them inauthentic. The criteria Zenodotus used for these judgments aren't entirely clear because his work survives only in fragments quoted by later scholars. But he was apparently influenced by linguistic considerations, whether a word or phrase fit Homeric dialect and vocabulary, and by aesthetic judgments about whether a passage fit the poem's style and themes. This was subjective scholarship requiring both technical knowledge and literary sensitivity. Modern classicists still argue about whether Zenodotus's editorial decisions were correct, which gives you a sense of how difficult the work was and remains. Zenodotus also worked on other texts, including the poetry of Hesiod and Anacreon. His approach established the model for later Alexandrian textual criticism. Gather multiple manuscripts, compare variants, make reasoned judgments about authenticity, produce an edited text with critical notes explaining your choices. This might sound tedious, and honestly it often was tedious, but it was also essential. Without this work, ancient texts would have continued proliferating in increasingly corrupt versions, and eventually the original readings would have been lost entirely beneath layers of accumulated errors. The critical signs that Zenodotus and his successors developed were an important innovation. These were symbols written in the margins of manuscripts to indicate editorial decisions. An obolus, which looked like a horizontal line with dots, marked lines that seemed problematic but that the editor wasn't removing entirely. An asterisk indicated a line that appeared in multiple places or was possibly misplaced. A dipple, which was a wedge-shaped mark, indicated something noteworthy about a passage, an interesting reading, a grammatical peculiarity, something worth the reader's attention. These signs allowed editors to communicate their judgments without altering the text itself, preserving variant readings while indicating editorial concerns. Aristophanes of Byzantium, who directed the library in the early 2nd century BCE, expanded and refined these critical techniques. He developed a more elaborate system of accentuation and punctuation for Greek texts, which hadn't been standardized previously. Ancient Greek manuscripts were written in continuous text without spaces between words, with minimal punctuation and without systematic marking of pitch accents that were important for proper pronunciation. Reading such texts required skill and practice. Aristophanes introduced consistent marks for accents and breathing marks, making texts more accessible to readers and reducing ambiguity in interpretation. Aristophanes also worked on establishing accurate texts of major Greek authors beyond Homer. He edited the Greek tragic playwrights, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, comparing manuscripts and establishing what he considered authentic versions. He wrote commentaries explaining difficult passages, identifying mythological references, clarifying archaic vocabulary. His editions became standard references, the versions that later scribes copied and that eventually transmitted these plays to later centuries. Without Aristophanes' editorial work, we'd probably have worse texts of Greek tragedy, with more errors and more uncertainty about what the playwrights actually wrote. He also worked on comedy, including the plays of Aristophanes, no relation, despite the identical name, which must have been confusing even in antiquity. Aristophanes the Byzantine's edition of Aristophanes the comic playwright involved similar textual work, collating manuscripts, amending errors, writing explanatory notes. The comedies presented additional challenges because they contained contemporary references, political jokes, and wordplay that might not be clear to readers centuries after the plays were written. The commentaries explaining these references became almost as important as the texts themselves, preserving context that would otherwise have been lost. Aristarchus of Samothrace, who followed Aristophanes as library director and worked in the mid-2nd century BCE, is generally considered the greatest of the Alexandrian textual critics. His work on Homer was so thorough and influential that later scholars referred to textual disputes by citing __quote _18_ as authoritative. He apparently wrote extensive commentaries on both the Iliad and Odyssey, discussing textual variants, defending or rejecting specific readings, explaining grammatical constructions, identifying mythological background, and generally providing a comprehensive scholarly apparatus for understanding Homer. Aristarchus's critical principle was to interpret Homer through Homer, using Homer's own vocabulary and usage elsewhere in the poems to decide disputed readings, rather than imposing external standards. If a word appeared unusual, Aristarchus would search the rest of Homer to see whether similar usage occurred elsewhere. If a passage seemed inconsistent, he'd look for parallel passages to establish whether the inconsistency was real or merely apparent. This principle of internal evidence was sophisticated textual criticism, recognizing that each author has distinctive patterns of language and composition that can guide editorial decisions. The scholarly debates between these critics and their followers were apparently intense. Different editors made different choices about disputed passages, and they defended their decisions in commentaries that criticized their predecessors and contemporaries. These weren't friendly academic disagreements. Ancient scholarly controversy could get quite personal, with editors accusing each other of incompetence, ignorance, or deliberately perverse readings. The scholarly culture at Alexandria was competitive and sometimes bitter, which isn't surprising given that reputations and positions depended on demonstrating scholarly superiority over rivals. The practice of writing biographies of authors, which became standard for literary scholarship, also developed at Alexandria. These biographies, ancient critics called them lives, provided context for understanding authors' works. The biographical tradition in ancient literary criticism started from the sensible premise that knowing something about an author's life might help interpret their writing. Unfortunately, ancient biographers often had limited reliable information and supplemented it with speculation, anecdotes of dubious authenticity, and details derived from reading the author's works as autobiography. The result was a biographical tradition that mixed genuine historical information with legendary material and literary interpretation. These biographies became standard introductions to authors' works, included at the beginning of manuscripts or compiled in separate collections. They influenced how readers understood texts. If the biography of Euripides portrayed him as a misanthrope, readers might interpret his plays through that lens. If the biography of Sappho discussed her romantic relationships, readers might read her poetry as directly autobiographical. The biographical tradition created frameworks for interpretation that could be illuminating or misleading, depending on how reliable the biographical information was. The question of authenticity, determining which works attributed to an author were actually written by them, was a major concern for Alexandrian scholars. Famous authors attracted false attributions. Someone writing in the style of Plato might have their work circulated under Plato's name, either through misunderstanding or deliberate fraud. Students' works might be attributed to their teachers. Anonymous works might acquire attributions based on speculation. The library's comprehensive collection included many texts of dubious authorship, and the scholarly work of sorting genuine from spurious became a significant part of textual criticism. The criteria for judging authenticity included stylistic analysis. Did the language and style match the author's known works? Historical evidence. Were there contemporary references to the work? Manuscript tradition. Did old, reliable manuscripts attribute the work to this author? Thematic consistency. Did the work's ideas fit with the author's philosophy? These criteria were imperfect, and scholars disagreed about how to apply them, but the systematic attempt to distinguish genuine from spurious works represented serious critical methodology. Let's talk about the physical process of editing texts, because it wasn't just an intellectual exercise. It required handling manuscripts, marking them up, producing revised versions. An editor working on a text would need access to multiple manuscripts for comparison. These would be laid out probably on tables or reading stands, and the editor would work through them systematically, comparing each passage. When variants appeared, the editor would note them, consider which reading seemed most authentic, and mark their decision. This might involve writing notes on a separate papyrus, or adding marginal annotations to a working copy of the text. Producing the final edited version required deciding how to present the text. The editor might choose one manuscript as the base text and amend it where necessary, noting alternative readings in margins or in separate commentaries. Or the editor might create an entirely new fair copy incorporating their editorial decisions, possibly with critical signs indicating problematic passages. The resulting edited text would then itself be copied, potentially many times, and these copies would circulate to other libraries and scholars, gradually replacing older, less accurate versions. The commentaries that accompanied edited texts served multiple purposes. They explained editorial decisions, providing the reasoning behind choosing one reading over another. They clarified difficult vocabulary, especially archaic or unusual words. They identified mythological references, historical allusions, geographical details. They discussed grammatical constructions, poetic meter, rhetorical techniques. These commentaries transformed texts into teaching tools, making difficult ancient literature accessible to students and scholars who needed guidance to understand it fully. The system of citations developed by Alexandrian scholars was also significant. When discussing a text, scholars needed ways to refer to specific passages precisely. Without modern conveniences like page numbers or line numbers, this required other methods. For Homer, scholars used book numbers and then referenced the first few words of the passage in question. For other texts, various systems emerged, but the principle was establishing common reference points that allowed different scholars in different locations to discuss the same passages with clarity. This may sound like a minor technical detail, but it's actually crucial for scholarly communication. You can't have productive academic debate if participants can't agree on what text they're discussing. The concept of the definitive edition, which Alexandrian criticism promoted, had lasting influence. The idea that there should be one authoritative version of an important text, established through scholarly comparison and critical judgment, became foundational to how later cultures approached classical literature. Medieval scribes copied the texts that Alexandrian scholars had edited. Renaissance humanists sought out manuscripts that preserved Alexandrian editorial work. Modern classical philology still references Alexandrian critical decisions when establishing texts. The scholars working in the library couldn't have known their editorial choices would influence textual transmission for 2 millennia, but that's exactly what happened. Let's acknowledge the losses, because for all that Alexandrian scholarship preserved, much more was lost. The Pinaikes itself survived only in fragments. We know about Callimachus's work from later authors who quoted it, not from the original. Most Alexandrian commentaries are lost, known only from scattered citations in works that did survive. The critical editions that Alexandrian scholars produced influenced later manuscript traditions, but we don't have those original editions. We have medieval manuscripts that descended from them through many generations of copying. The library's collection itself, which was probably the most comprehensive assembly of Greek literature that ever existed, was gradually lost through various disasters we'll discuss later. What survived was what scribes in later centuries chose to copy, which was a fraction of what Alexandria once held. The scholarly work done at Alexandria also had biases and limitations. The critics focused primarily on canonical authors: Homer, the tragic playwrights, major historians and philosophers. Lesser-known authors received less attention. Technical literature, popular literature, women authors, non-Greek literature, all of these categories were either ignored or treated as less important than the canonical texts. The canon that Alexandrian scholarship created or reinforced was selective, reflecting the aesthetic and cultural values of Hellenistic Greek scholars. This shaped what literature survived antiquity, because texts that weren't studied and copied eventually disappeared. The practical work of running the library's operations involved substantial staff beyond the famous scholars. There were the scribes doing the copying, the librarians managing the physical collection, the administrators handling budgets and acquisition contracts, the staff maintaining the buildings and managing the environmental controls. There were probably specialists in different languages for dealing with non-Greek texts: Egyptian hieratic and demotic, Aramaic, Hebrew, Persian, other languages represented in Alexandria's cosmopolitan collections. These support staff made the scholarly work possible, but remain mostly anonymous in historical records. The cost of operating the library must have been substantial. Papyrus was expensive. Paying skilled scribes was expensive. Funding acquisition agents travelling throughout the Mediterranean was expensive. Building and maintaining the storage facilities was expensive. Supporting the scholars who used the collections was expensive. All of this required continuous funding from the royal treasury, which meant the library's success depended on the kingdom remaining wealthy and on successive rulers continuing to prioritise intellectual pursuits. When those conditions changed, the library's golden age ended. The relationship between the library and libraries elsewhere in the Mediterranean was both cooperative and competitive. Scholars travelled between different intellectual centres, carrying knowledge and texts with them. Alexandria borrowed texts from other libraries for copying, just as other libraries borrowed from Alexandria. But there was also rivalry, particularly with Pergamum, whose library was explicitly designed to compete with Alexandria's. The Ptolemies reportedly banned papyrus exports to Pergamum at one point to hinder their rival's library, which supposedly led Pergamum to develop parchment, animal skin prepared for writing, as an alternative writing material. This story is probably exaggerated, but it reflects the competitive dynamics of Hellenistic library building. The scholarly networks that developed around the library extended Alexandria's influence far beyond the city's walls. Scholars who studied at Alexandria returned to their home cities carrying Alexandrian methods and texts. Students of Alexandrian critics became teachers elsewhere, spreading critical techniques and edited texts. Libraries in other cities acquired copies of works from Alexandria's collection. Gradually, Alexandrian editorial standards and organizational systems became the norm for Greek literary scholarship throughout the Mediterranean world. This was cultural imperialism through bibliography, exporting Alexandria's intellectual frameworks along with its texts. The work of organizing, cataloguing, editing, and preserving texts that happened at Alexandria represented a particular vision of what a library should be and do. This wasn't just a repository where texts happened to accumulate. This was an active institution that sought out texts, processed them systematically, made them available to scholars under controlled conditions, and produced improved versions that would better serve future readers. This institutional model of librarianship, active collecting, systematic organization, scholarly processing, controlled access, preservation for the future, became the template for what serious libraries aspired to be. The Library of Alexandria invented not just bibliographic practices, but the concept of the library as an intellectual institution, rather than just a book warehouse. One final observation about this phase of the library's history: the work was never finished. There was always another text to acquire, another manuscript to collate, another author to catalogue, another disputed passage to resolve. The universality that the library aimed for was inherently unreachable. There would always be more texts being written, more corners of the world to search for existing texts, more scholarly work to do on texts already in the collection. But the impossibility of completing the project didn't make the project worthless. The systematic pursuit of comprehensive collection and rigorous scholarship produced achievements that lasted far beyond Alexandria's power and prosperity. Sometimes the value is in the pursuit, not in the completion, because completion was never really the point. The point was creating an institution and a culture that valued knowledge enough to invest enormous resources in collecting, preserving, and understanding it. And for a few brilliant centuries, Alexandria did exactly that. While the library was busy cataloguing every book it could get its hands on, and scholars were arguing about whether Homer really wrote that line or not, another group of intellectuals at Alexandria was doing something that would turn out to be even more impactful in the long run. They were inventing science as we know it. not philosophy, not natural speculation, not what if the universe is made of water kind of thinking. Actual systematic investigation of the natural world using observation, measurement, and mathematical reasoning. The Ptolemies funded this work the same way they funded everything else, as a state project, with scholars on royal payroll pursuing questions that might or might not have immediate practical value. Let's start with Euclid, because Euclid's contribution to mathematics is so fundamental that it's almost invisible to us now. We learn geometry, and we don't usually think about the fact that someone had to organize geometric knowledge into a coherent system with axioms, postulates, and logical proofs building on each other in careful sequence. That someone was Euclid, working at Alexandria probably during the reign of Ptolemy I, around 300 BCE. He wrote a work called The Elements that organized all of Greek geometric knowledge into 13 books, starting from basic definitions and axioms, and building up to complex theorems about solid geometry and number theory. The Elements wasn't just a compilation of existing knowledge, though it was certainly that. It was a demonstration of how mathematics should be done. Start with basic assumptions that are obviously true or at least plausible, define your terms clearly, and then use logical reasoning to prove everything else. This axiomatic method became the model for mathematical reasoning for the next 2,000 years. Every geometry student who's ever struggled through a proof about triangles or circles has been following the system that Euclid established at Alexandria. So if you hated geometry in school, you know who to blame. Sort of. Though to be fair, Euclid was just organizing knowledge that already existed rather than inventing the entire field to torment future students. Euclid's Elements covered plane geometry, the geometry of flat surfaces, points, lines, triangles, circles, all the basic shapes. But it also covered solid geometry, three-dimensional shapes like spheres and polyhedra, and it covered number theory, including proofs about prime numbers and perfect numbers. Books 7 through 10 are about numbers and ratios rather than geometric shapes, which makes the title quote _21 slightly misleading. Really, it should be quote 22 but naming conventions were apparently more flexible in the ancient world. The famous story about Euclid, which is probably apocryphal but captures something true about his approach, involves Ptolemy asking if there was an easier way to learn geometry than working through the elements. Euclid supposedly replied that there is no royal road to geometry, meaning that even kings have to do the work of understanding the proofs. There are no shortcuts. This story might be invented, but it reflects the Elements' character. This was rigorous, systematic mathematics that required effort to master. You couldn't just skim it and get the gist. You had to work through the proofs, understand the logic, see how each theorem built on previous results. The Elements' influence is hard to overstate. It was copied and recopied throughout antiquity and the Middle Ages. It was translated into Arabic, then from Arabic into Latin, then eventually into every major European language. For 2 millennia, if you were learning geometry, you were learning it from Euclid or from textbooks based on Euclid. The Elements is probably the most successful textbook ever written, in terms of longevity and influence. Isaac Newton studied Euclid. Abraham Lincoln studied Euclid. Generations of students cursed Euclid's name while struggling with geometric proofs. That's a legacy, though perhaps not the legacy Euclid was aiming for when he organized his material. Euclid apparently wrote other works as well, treatises on optics, on music theory, on other mathematical topics. Most of these haven't survived, which is unfortunate because they'd probably be interesting. But the Elements survived, and that one work was sufficient to secure Euclid's immortality, which is more than most ancient authors managed. The irony is that we know almost nothing about Euclid as a person. We don't know exactly when he was born or died, where he came from originally, what his life at Alexandria was like. He left behind this monumental work of mathematics and basically no personal information at all. In contrast, we know lots of personal details about mediocre poets whose work has been lost. History's priorities are sometimes puzzling. Now let's talk about Eratosthenes, who was a different kind of scholar, a polymath who made contributions to multiple fields and was apparently nicknamed Beta by his contemporaries, meaning second, because he was second best at everything rather than the absolute best at any single thing. This might sound like an insult, but being second best at multiple different fields simultaneously is actually pretty impressive, and the nickname probably reflected some combination of genuine respect and gentle teasing. Eratosthenes worked at Alexandria during the 3rd century BCE, eventually becoming head of the library, which was obviously a prestigious position, but also one that came with administrative responsibilities that probably interfered with his research. The ancient equivalent of making your best scientist the department chair, technically a promotion, practically a burden. Eratosthenes' most famous achievement was calculating the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy. The method he used was elegantly simple in concept, though challenging in execution. He knew that at noon on the summer solstice in the city of Sienne, modern Aswan, the sun was directly overhead, so that a vertical stick cast no shadow and sunlight shone directly down to the bottom of a deep well. Meanwhile, at the same moment in Alexandria, which was north of Sienne, a vertical stick did cast a shadow, because the sun wasn't quite directly overhead. By measuring the angle of that shadow, Eratosthenes could determine the angular difference between Alexandria and Sienne as measured from the centre of the Earth. The angle turned out to be about 1/50th of a complete circle, so if the distance between Alexandria and Sienne represented 1/50th of the Earth's circumference, then the Earth's circumference would be 50 times that distance. Eratosthenes had information about the distance between the cities. Apparently, professional pacers who measured long distances for various purposes had established it as 5,000 stadia, a stadion being a Greek unit of length. Multiply 5,000 by 50, and you get 250,000 stadia for the Earth's circumference. Eratosthenes apparently later revised this to 252,000 stadia, probably to make the math work out more cleanly with other calculations. The question is how accurate this was, and the answer depends on which stadion Eratosthenes was using, because ancient distance units were not perfectly standardized. If he was using the Attic stadion of about 185 meters, his result was within about 2% of the actual equatorial circumference of Earth. If he was using the Egyptian stadion of about 157 meters, his result was less accurate but still remarkably close. Either way, Eratosthenes demonstrated that you could measure the size of the entire planet using geometry, careful observation, and information about terrestrial distances. This was applied mathematics at its finest, using abstract geometric reasoning to answer a concrete physical question about the world. The method required several assumptions. It assumed that the Earth was spherical, which Greek natural philosophers had argued for on various grounds. The Earth's shadow on the moon during lunar eclipses is round. Ships disappear hull first over the horizon. Different stars are visible from different latitudes. It assumed that the sun was far enough away that its rays were effectively parallel when they reached Earth, which was geometrically necessary for the calculation to work and which was true, though Eratosthenes probably couldn't verify it directly. It assumed that Alexandria and Sienne were on the same meridian line, which they approximately were, though not exactly. Given these assumptions, the method was sound, and the result was impressively accurate. Eratosthenes made other important contributions to geography. He apparently created one of the first systematic maps of the known world using geometric principles and astronomical observations to determine positions. He developed a coordinate system with lines of latitude and longitude, though not identical to the modern system. He compiled geographic information from travellers, traders, and military campaigns, trying to create a comprehensive picture of the inhabited world. His geography treatise was apparently 3 volumes long and covered both theoretical principles of geography and detailed descriptions of specific regions. Like most of his works, it hasn't survived in its original form, but later geographers quoted and built on his work. Eratosthenes also worked on mathematics, developing what's called the sieve of Eratosthenes, an algorithm for finding prime numbers. The method is straightforward. Write down all numbers starting from 2, then systematically eliminate multiples of each prime as you find them. What remains are the primes. This isn't an efficient method for finding very large primes, but it works fine for smaller numbers, and it demonstrates systematic mathematical thinking. Eratosthenes was working on number theory, as well as geometry and geography, maintaining the Alexandrian tradition of not limiting yourself to a single field of inquiry. He also worked on chronology, trying to establish accurate dates for historical events using various sources and astronomical data. He wrote poetry. He was a serious scholar in the Greek tradition where poetry and science weren't separate domains. He worked on literary criticism, philology, philosophy. The nickname Beta makes more sense in this context. Eratosthenes was doing professional-level work in multiple fields simultaneously, which meant he couldn't devote himself exclusively to any single field the way specialists could. Being second best at 6 different things is arguably more impressive than being the best at one thing. though academic cultures tend to reward specialization, which might explain the slightly backhanded nickname. Now let's talk about the engineers and physicians, because Alexandria wasn't just doing abstract mathematics and geography, it was also developing practical technologies and advancing medical knowledge. The museum's workshops produced mechanical devices, some of which were purely demonstrative but others of which had real applications. The physicians at Alexandria advanced anatomical knowledge through direct observation, which sounds obvious, but was actually quite unusual in the ancient world where religious and cultural restrictions often prevented detailed anatomical study. Ctesibius, working in the 3rd century BCE, invented or improved various mechanical devices. His force pump used pistons and valves to move water, which had applications in firefighting, mining, and creating water displays. The mechanism was ingenious, a piston moving in a cylinder with one-way valves that allowed water to enter from below but not exit, forcing it out through a discharge pipe instead. This principle of using pistons and valves to move fluids would eventually become fundamental to many types of machinery, though it would take centuries before the full potential was realized. Ctesibius also worked on improved water clocks, developing mechanisms that regulated water flow to provide more accurate timekeeping than previous designs. The water clocks were more complex than you might imagine. Simple water clocks just let water drip from one container to another at a supposedly steady rate, with time measured by how much water accumulated or drained. But water flow rates change with pressure, which changes as the water level changes, so simple designs weren't very accurate. Ctesibius developed constant pressure systems using floats and overflow mechanisms to maintain steady water levels and therefore steady flow rates. He also developed gear systems to translate the steady vertical motion of a float into rotational motion that could drive indicators showing hours. These were sophisticated machines, requiring precision manufacturing and clever mechanical design. The practical applications of Ctesibius's work were important, but so was the theoretical significance. He was demonstrating that pneumatics and hydraulics, the behavior of air and water under pressure, followed understandable principles that could be exploited for practical purposes. This was natural philosophy becoming engineering, abstract understanding becoming practical application. The museum provided an environment where this kind of work could happen, where a craftsman-scholar could experiment with mechanisms and develop new technologies, with royal funding supporting the work. Philo of Byzantium, who was probably Ctesibius's student, wrote extensive treatises on mechanics, pneumatics, and military engineering. His works covered catapults, siege engines, automata, water-lifting devices, defensive fortifications. Some of this was theoretical, describing principles and ideal designs, but some was practical, with detailed instructions for construction and use. Philo's work circulated beyond Alexandria and influenced military engineering throughout the Hellenistic world. When armies needed better catapults or more effective siege engines, they consulted treatises written by scholars working at Alexandria's museum. Hero of Alexandria, who worked much later, probably the 1st century CE, long after the museum's golden age, represents the culmination of the Alexandrian engineering tradition. His surviving works cover an impressive range: pneumatics, mechanics, automata, optics, geometry, surveying. He described a steam-powered device called an aeolipile, a hollow sphere with bent tubes attached, mounted so it could rotate freely. When steam was generated inside the sphere, it shot out through the tubes, causing the sphere to spin. This was essentially a reaction turbine, the basic principle behind jet engines, though obviously Hero wasn't building jet engines. He was demonstrating principles of pneumatics and mechanics using steam pressure. Hero's works included descriptions of automatic doors for temples that opened when a fire was lit on the altar. The fire heated air in a chamber below the altar. The expanding air pushed water from one container to another. The weight of the water pulled on ropes connected to the door hinges. When the fire went out and the air cooled, the process reversed and the doors closed. This was theatre as much as technology, creating impressive effects that would seem magical to observers who didn't understand the mechanism. Temples in the ancient world competed for prestige and worshippers, and impressive mechanical effects could help attract both. Hero also described various mechanical toys and automata: statues that poured wine, mechanical birds that sang, miniature theatres with automated figures that moved through entire dramatic scenes. Some of these were preserved in later Arabic translations of Hero's works, which is fortunate because the original Greek versions were mostly lost. The Arabic translation tradition of Greek scientific works preserved knowledge that would otherwise have disappeared entirely, which is worth remembering when we get to discussing the library's eventual destruction. Knowledge can survive the loss of specific collections if it's been disseminated widely enough. Hero's work on surveying and measuring devices had practical applications. He described instruments for measuring distances, for determining the height of walls or towers, for calculating the area of land plots. These weren't just theoretical exercises. Surveyors needed these techniques for land management, tax assessment, engineering projects. Hero provided systematic methods with geometric justification, turning craft knowledge into documented technical expertise. His approach was characteristic of Alexandrian science. Take practical problems, apply mathematical and geometric reasoning, develop systematic methods, document them clearly for others to use. Now let's turn to medicine, because the medical work done at Alexandria was genuinely revolutionary, though also somewhat disturbing from a modern ethical standpoint. Herophilus and Erasistratus, working in the early 3rd century BCE, conducted systematic dissections of human bodies to study anatomy. This was extremely unusual in the ancient world. Most cultures had religious or social prohibitions against cutting up corpses, which meant anatomical knowledge was limited to what you could observe from external examination or from wounds and injuries. Systematic internal anatomy required actually opening bodies and examining organs, blood vessels, muscles, bones, all the internal structures that normally remain hidden. Alexandria apparently allowed this, possibly because the Ptolemies' support for scientific research overrode traditional restrictions, possibly because the cosmopolitan nature of the city meant that traditional Greek taboos carried less weight. Herophilus and Erasistratus had access to corpses for dissection, probably executed criminals, which was the usual source for anatomical subjects in periods when dissection was permitted. Whether they also practiced vivisection on condemned criminals, as later sources accused, is uncertain. The accusations come from authors writing centuries later with various axes to grind, so they're not entirely reliable. But even if the vivisection stories are false, the dissection work was real, and it produced genuine anatomical knowledge. Herophilus made major discoveries about the brain and nervous system. Previous medical theory had debated whether the brain or the heart was the centre of sensation and thought. Herophilus, through direct observation, established that the brain was the centre of the nervous system, and that nerves connected the brain to the rest of the body. He distinguished between sensory nerves and motor nerves, nerves that carried information to the brain versus nerves that carried commands from the brain to muscles. He studied the anatomy of the eye, describing the retina, the optic nerve, and other structures. He investigated the reproductive system, describing the ovaries, fallopian tubes, and uterus in women. Herophilus also studied the circulatory system, though his understanding was limited by the fact that the heart's pumping action and the role of circulation weren't yet understood. He noted that arteries were thicker walled than veins, and that they pulsed in rhythm with the heartbeat. He developed methods for measuring pulse rates and argued that pulse characteristics could help diagnose diseases. This was clinical medicine based on systematic observation, using measurable physiological parameters to assess health and identify problems. The idea that medicine should be based on observation and measurement, rather than just theoretical reasoning, was not universal in ancient medicine, so Herophilus's approach was genuinely innovative. Erasistratus worked on similar anatomical problems, but reached somewhat different conclusions about physiology. He distinguished clearly between veins and arteries, recognizing that they were different types of blood vessels with different functions. He studied the heart's valves and described how they allowed blood to flow in only one direction. He developed theories about how blood and pneuma, which he conceived of as something like vital air or spirit, moved through the body and powered bodily functions. His theories weren't entirely accurate by modern standards, but they were based on actual anatomical observation rather than pure speculation. Erasistratus also studied the brain in detail, noting the complex folding of the brain's surface and hypothesizing that more complex folding indicated greater intelligence. This turned out to be sort of correct. Brain surface area does correlate with cognitive capacity, and folding is how you pack more surface area into a limited skull volume, though Erasistratus couldn't verify his hypothesis empirically. He was also interested in the distinction between the cerebrum and cerebellum, the two major parts of the brain, and he attempted to understand their different functions. The medical training that happened at Alexandria combined theoretical knowledge with practical experience. Students studied anatomy from direct observation of dissections. They learned about diseases by observing patients and noting symptoms, progression, and outcomes. They learned surgical techniques by watching experienced physicians and eventually practicing under supervision. This clinical approach to medical education was more systematic than what was available in most places in the ancient world, where medical training was often more like apprenticeship with individual physicians who might or might not have much systematic knowledge. The medical school at Alexandria apparently attracted students from across the Mediterranean world. Physicians trained at Alexandria carried Alexandrian medical knowledge back to their home cities, spreading techniques and theoretical understanding. This network effect meant that Alexandrian medicine influenced medical practice far beyond Egypt, just as Alexandrian literary scholarship influenced how texts were studied elsewhere, and Alexandrian mathematics influenced how geometry was taught. Alexandria was functioning as an intellectual hub, attracting talent, developing knowledge, and exporting that knowledge through students and visitors who carried it elsewhere. Let's acknowledge that some of the medical experimentation at Alexandria would be considered deeply unethical by modern standards. If the vivisection accusations were true, that would be performing invasive and painful procedures on living people without anesthesia or any possibility of their consent, purely for research purposes. Even if those accusations were false, the dissection of executed criminals still involved using human bodies without consent for scientific purposes. The Ptolemaic state's willingness to provide corpses for dissection implied a certain disregard for the bodily integrity of executed criminals, treating them as research material rather than as people deserving respectful treatment even in death. Modern medical ethics developed partly in response to historical abuses, so it's not surprising that ancient medical research violated modern ethical standards that didn't exist yet. But we should acknowledge the ethical problems rather than glossing over them. The anatomical knowledge that Herophilus and Erasistratus produced was valuable and advanced medical understanding, but it came at a cost that we should recognize. The tension between advancing scientific knowledge and respecting human dignity is not a new problem. It's been present throughout the history of medicine and remains relevant today. The practical applications of Alexandrian science and medicine benefited the Ptolemaic state directly. Better surveying methods meant more accurate land assessment and fairer taxation. Improved water lifting devices meant better irrigation and more efficient use of water resources. Military engineering advances meant more effective siege engines and better defensive fortifications. Medical knowledge meant better treatment for soldiers, workers, and the elite. The museum wasn't just producing abstract knowledge, it was producing practical benefits that justified the state investment in research. This model of state-funded research with practical applications would reappear throughout history. Medieval Islamic states funded research that advanced agriculture, medicine, and engineering. Renaissance Italian city-states supported research that aided navigation, military technology, and industrial production. Modern governments fund research through universities and national laboratories, seeking both abstract knowledge and practical applications. Alexandria established the pattern. If you want scientific and technological advancement, institutional support works better than leaving everything to individual initiative. Funding research is expensive, but the returns, both intellectual and practical, can justify the investment. The social status of different types of scholars at Alexandria reflected ancient Greek attitudes about theoretical versus practical work. Pure mathematicians like Euclid had high status. Mathematics was considered a noble pursuit worthy of free men, requiring intellect rather than manual labour. Physicians had respectable status. Medicine was an important skill requiring extensive knowledge. Engineers and mechanics had more ambiguous status. Their work involved actual physical construction, which brought it closer to manual labour and therefore lower status in Greek social hierarchies. But Alexandria's environment, with its emphasis on practical applications and its integration of different types of inquiry, probably blurred these status distinctions somewhat. The workshops where experimental apparatus was built and mechanical devices were constructed required skilled craftsmen, metalworkers, woodworkers, glassmakers. These craftsmen might not have been considered scholars in the formal sense, but their skills were essential to the scientific work. You can't build a working water clock without someone who can precisely manufacture gears and valves. You can't create glass vessels for chemical or medical experiments without skilled glassblowers. The boundary between craft and science was permeable at Alexandria, with craftsmen contributing technical skills that enabled scholars' experimental work. The astronomical observations conducted at Alexandria required instruments, armillary spheres for measuring celestial positions, sundials for timekeeping, angular measuring devices. The data collected through these instruments over many years allowed astronomers to track planetary motions, predict eclipses, refine calendars. This was observational science requiring patience, precision, and systematic record-keeping. Single observations might be interesting, but scientific value came from accumulating observations over time, which required institutional continuity. The museum provided that continuity, with observations conducted over generations building a database that later astronomers could analyze. The mathematical work done at Alexandria went beyond Euclid's geometry. Apollonius of Perga, working in the late 3rd century BCE, wrote extensively about conic sections, the curves you get by slicing a cone at different angles, producing circles, ellipses, parabolas, and hyperbolas. This might sound like abstract mathematics with no practical purpose, but these curves turned out to be fundamental to understanding planetary orbits, projectile motion, and various other physical phenomena. Apollonius couldn't have known this. Kepler's discovery that planets move in elliptical orbits was 18 centuries in the future, but the mathematical groundwork was being laid. Number theory also advanced at Alexandria. Work on prime numbers, perfect numbers, figurate numbers, and other properties of integers continued the tradition that Euclid had compiled in the Elements. Some of this was purely abstract, investigating numerical patterns for their own interest, rather than for any practical application. But the boundary between pure and applied mathematics has always been fuzzy. Techniques developed for abstract problems often turn out to have unexpected applications, sometimes centuries later. Alexandria's mathematicians were building a toolkit of mathematical methods that would prove useful in ways they couldn't anticipate. The integration of mathematics with physical investigation was characteristic of Alexandrian science. Archimedes, though based in Syracuse rather than Alexandria, studied at Alexandria and maintained connections to the mathematical community there. His work combined geometry with mechanics, using mathematical reasoning to understand levers, buoyancy, the behavior of fluids, the properties of curved surfaces. He famously discovered the principle of buoyancy while taking a bath and allegedly ran naked through the streets shouting, quote, 26, though this story is probably apocryphal. But whether or not the bath story is true, Archimedes' work demonstrated how mathematical reasoning could illuminate physical phenomena. The Ptolemies' military needs drove some of the engineering work. Catapults that could throw larger projectiles, siege towers that could reach higher walls, better defensive fortifications, naval technologies for their fleet. All of these had military applications that interested the royal government. The museum's engineers worked on military problems alongside their more abstract investigations. This might seem like a corruption of pure research, but from the Ptolemies' perspective, they were funding the museum with resources extracted from Egyptian agriculture, so expecting some practical return on that investment was reasonable. The scholars probably didn't object too strenuously. Royal funding paid their stipends, so maintaining the royal patron's interest was in everyone's interest. The relationship between theory and practice in Alexandrian science was more integrated than it would become in later European science, where pure research was sometimes seen as nobler than applied work. Alexandrian scholars moved fluidly between abstract mathematics and practical applications, between theoretical medicine and clinical practice, between geometric proofs and surveying techniques. This integration was productive, allowing each domain to inform the other. Practical problems suggested theoretical questions. Theoretical insights enabled practical innovations. The modern distinction between basic and applied research would have seemed strange at Alexandria, where research was research and its value didn't depend on whether applications were immediate or distant. Let's talk about the limits of Alexandrian science. Despite major achievements, there were areas where progress stalled or where fundamental errors persisted. Astronomy developed sophisticated mathematical models for predicting celestial motions, but these models were geocentric. They assumed Earth was at the center of the universe with everything else revolving around it. Aristarchus of Samos proposed a heliocentric model, with Earth orbiting the Sun. But this proposal wasn't widely accepted, partly because it conflicted with physical intuitions about motion, and partly because the observational evidence available at the time didn't definitively favour either model. Physics remained largely qualitative rather than quantitative. The mathematics existed to describe motion mathematically. Alexandrian mathematicians were certainly capable of the required calculations, but the conceptual framework for understanding motion quantitatively hadn't been developed. Questions about why things move, what causes acceleration, how forces work, these remained philosophical rather than mathematical questions. It would take until the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries for physics to become thoroughly mathematized, building on medieval developments that themselves built on ancient foundations. Chemistry didn't really exist as a science in the modern sense. There was practical knowledge of materials, metallurgy, dyes, medicines, but no systematic theory of chemical composition or reactions. Alchemy existed, with its mixture of practical techniques and mystical philosophy, but this wasn't yet chemistry. The conceptual tools for understanding matter at a level deeper than its obvious properties, hardness, colour, solubility, hadn't been developed. Alexandrian science made impressive advances in fields that could be approached through geometry, observation, and logical reasoning. But fields requiring different conceptual frameworks remained underdeveloped. The experimental method as we understand it, systematic testing of hypotheses through controlled experiments, wasn't fully developed in Alexandrian science. There were experiments in the sense of trials and demonstrations, and there was systematic observation. But the rigorous experimental methodology that would characterize later science wasn't yet standard practice. This isn't a criticism. Developing that methodology took centuries. But it's worth noting that Alexandrian science, impressive as it was still early in the process of developing what would become scientific method. The social and political instability that would eventually affect Alexandria limited the continuity of scientific work. Science benefits from long-term stability, from institutions that persist over generations, from the accumulation of knowledge and techniques over time. Alexandria provided this for a few centuries, but as the Ptolemaic dynasty declined and Rome absorbed Egypt into its empire, the conditions that had made Alexandria a scientific centre deteriorated. Funding became less reliable, political turmoil disrupted work, scholars dispersed to other locations. The museum continued to exist in some form, but its golden age was over. Despite these limitations and eventual decline, Alexandria's scientific achievements were remarkable. Euclid's geometry would dominate mathematical education for 2 millennia. Eratosthenes' calculation of Earth's size demonstrated the power of mathematical reasoning applied to physical questions. Herophilus and Erasistratus advanced anatomical knowledge beyond what had been possible anywhere else. The engineering work produced practical technologies and theoretical understanding of mechanics. The astronomical observations and mathematical models advanced understanding of celestial phenomena. All of this was accomplished in a few centuries, in one city, supported by one dynasty's willingness to fund research as a state project. The model Alexandria established, of institutional support for research, of bringing together scholars from different fields, of integrating theoretical and practical work, of accumulating knowledge systematically over time, proved to be powerful. That model would be adapted and re-implemented in various forms throughout history. In Baghdad's House of Wisdom during the Islamic Golden Age, in medieval European universities, in Renaissance Italian academies, in modern research universities and national laboratories. Every time a government or institution decides to fund research, every time scholars from different disciplines collaborate, every time theoretical insights lead to practical applications, Alexandria's legacy is present. The buildings are gone, the original texts are lost, but the idea, the notion that supporting systematic inquiry into nature produces both knowledge and practical benefits, survived and flourished. One final thought about Alexandria's science. It was product of a specific historical moment when Greek mathematical and philosophical traditions encountered Egyptian wealth and administrative sophistication, when Ptolemaic political ambitions aligned with intellectual curiosity, when the cosmopolitan mixing of different cultures created an environment open to new ideas. That combination of factors was rare and probably unrepeatable. We can't recreate Alexandria any more than we can recreate Athens' classical period or Florence's Renaissance. But we can learn from what made Alexandria successful and apply those lessons in our own contexts, adapting the principles to modern circumstances. That's probably the most practical legacy of Alexandrian science, not specific discoveries, which have been superseded, but the demonstration that systematic support for research works, that bringing diverse minds together produces innovation, that investing in knowledge pays dividends that justify the cost. That lesson remains relevant, which is more than most ancient institutions can claim. While Alexandria's scholars were busy measuring the earth and dissecting corpses in the name of science, another equally important project was unfolding, making texts readable across language barriers. This wasn't just an academic exercise. This was cultural infrastructure, the ancient equivalent of building bridges between communities that spoke different languages and operated with different conceptual frameworks. The library wasn't just collecting Greek texts and organizing them systematically. It was also serving as a translation center, converting texts from other languages into Greek and occasionally vice versa, creating what we might call a semantic exchange system, where meanings could flow between different linguistic communities. The most famous translation project undertaken at Alexandria was the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. This project supposedly happened during the reign of Ptolemy II, probably in the 3rd century BCE, and the traditional story about how it happened is delightfully elaborate, though probably not entirely historically accurate. According to the legend, Ptolemy wanted a copy of the Jewish scriptures for the library and sent a request to the high priest in Jerusalem. The high priest responded by sending 72 scholars, 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, to Alexandria to produce the translation. These scholars were supposedly housed on the island of Pharos, where they worked independently and miraculously produced identical translations after 72 days, demonstrating divine inspiration. The reality was almost certainly less miraculous and more practical. There was a large Jewish community in Alexandria, we've mentioned this before, and this community needed Greek translations of their scriptures because many Alexandrian Jews spoke Greek better than Hebrew. The 2nd and 3rd generations of Jewish immigrants didn't necessarily maintain fluency in Hebrew, especially if their daily lives were conducted in Greek. They needed to be able to read their own religious texts, which meant those texts needed to exist in Greek. The Septuagint was produced to meet this community need, probably over an extended period by multiple translators, with various books translated at different times by different people. The number 72 in the traditional story was probably rounded to 70, which is where the name Septuagint comes from. It's Latin for 70. The miraculous agreement between translators working independently was probably legendary elaboration designed to claim divine authority for the translation. In reality, translation is messy, subjective work where different translators make different choices, and perfect agreement between independent translators would actually be suspicious rather than miraculous. But the legend served a purpose. It established the Septuagint as authoritative, as divinely approved, which helped it gain acceptance in the Jewish community and later in the Christian community that adopted it. The Septuagint project demonstrated something important about Alexandria's role in the ancient world. It was a place where different cultural traditions could interact and influence each other. Greek-speaking Jews needed their scriptures in Greek, so Greek-speaking Jewish scholars produced a translation. The translation itself became influential, affecting how Jewish and Christian communities understood their texts. Concepts that were clear in Hebrew might be ambiguous or have different connotations in Greek, so translation choices shaped theological understanding. When early Christians, most of whom spoke Greek rather than Hebrew, quoted scripture, they were often quoting the Septuagint version, which meant their interpretations were influenced by how those particular translators had rendered Hebrew concepts into Greek. Translation is never neutral. Every translation involves choices about how to render words, phrases, and concepts from one language into another, and those choices reflect the translator's understanding, priorities, and cultural context. When you translate religious texts, those choices can have theological implications. When you translate philosophical texts, those choices can affect how arguments are understood. When you translate technical texts, those choices can determine whether practical knowledge is successfully conveyed. Alexandria's translators were making decisions that would affect how texts were read and understood for centuries, though they probably didn't fully realize the extent of their influence. Beyond the Septuagint, other translation work happened at Alexandria, though we have less detailed information about most of it. Egyptian texts were translated into Greek, making Egyptian religious and historical traditions accessible to Greek readers. Greek texts were occasionally translated into other languages for export to non-Greek regions. Commercial documents, legal contracts, diplomatic correspondence, all of these required translation in a cosmopolitan trading hub where people speaking different languages needed to conduct business together. Translation was constant practical necessity, not just an occasional scholarly project. The challenge of translation went beyond just finding equivalent words. Different languages encode different assumptions about the world. Greek philosophical vocabulary included concepts that didn't have exact equivalents in other languages. Egyptian religious concepts didn't always map neatly onto Greek categories. Jewish monotheism was conceptually different from Greek polytheism, which meant translating religious texts between these traditions required not just linguistic skill, but also cultural sensitivity and theological sophistication. A translator needed to understand both the source culture and the target culture, to recognize where concepts aligned and where they diverged, to make choices about when to translate literally and when to adapt for cultural context. Let's think about what this meant practically. Imagine you're a translator working at Alexandria, and you're translating an Egyptian religious text into Greek. The Egyptian text refers to concepts of divine power, cosmic order, the relationship between gods and humans, all expressed in Egyptian terminology with Egyptian cultural assumptions behind them. You need to find Greek words that will convey these concepts to Greek readers who don't share those cultural assumptions. Do you use existing Greek religious terminology, even though the concepts aren't quite identical? Do you transliterate Egyptian terms, keeping the foreign words but explaining them? Do you create new Greek compound words to express concepts that Greek doesn't have single words for? Each choice has trade-offs, and each choice affects how the translated text will be understood. The library served as what we might call a meaning converter, a place where texts from different traditions could be made mutually intelligible. This wasn't just about language. This was about creating shared conceptual frameworks that allowed people from different cultural backgrounds to understand each other's ideas. When Greek philosophers could read Egyptian wisdom literature in Greek translation, they could compare Egyptian and Greek ideas about similar topics. When Jewish scholars could read Greek philosophy in relation to their own scriptural traditions, they could develop synthetic approaches that drew on both traditions. This cross-pollination of ideas was one of Alexandria's most significant contributions to intellectual history. The marketplace, the temples, and the schools all needed this translation infrastructure. Merchants from different regions needed contracts and agreements that all parties could understand, which required translators who could work with commercial language in multiple tongues. Religious communities needed texts translated for their members who didn't speak the original languages, which required translators sensitive to theological nuances. Schools needed texts in languages their students could read, which required pedagogical translations that clarified difficult concepts. The library, with its multilingual collections and its concentration of scholarly expertise, was positioned to provide translation services for all these constituencies. Now let's talk about the daily reality of maintaining the library's collection, because this gets into the unglamorous but essential work that made the grand intellectual project possible. Collections don't maintain themselves. Texts don't magically stay readable. Knowledge preservation requires constant labour, careful attention to detail, and robust systems for managing physical materials. The scholars studying texts and making discoveries got the historical credit, but the scribes, librarians, and maintenance workers who kept the collection functional were equally essential, even if their names weren't recorded for posterity. The daily routine in the library's copying rooms probably started at dawn, because daylight was precious and most work had to happen while natural light was available. Scribes would arrive, collect their materials, papyrus sheets, reed pens, ink in ceramic jars, and settle into their workstations. In vocal copying sessions, one scribe would read aloud from an original text while multiple scribes wrote down what they heard, producing several copies simultaneously. This method was efficient for producing multiple copies quickly, but it had drawbacks. Any misheard word would be replicated in multiple copies. Homophones, words that sound the same but have different meanings and spellings, created opportunities for error. If the reader mumbled or spoke unclearly, the scribes might guess at words they didn't catch clearly. Visual copying, where a scribe looked at an original manuscript and copied it by hand, was slower but generally more accurate. The scribe could see punctuation, spacing, and formatting that might not be conveyed clearly in oral reading. They could pause to verify unclear passages rather than guessing. But visual copying was mentally taxing. Maintaining focus while copying text for hours requires concentration, and fatigue leads to errors. A tired scribe might skip lines, duplicate passages, or misread similar-looking letters. The Greek letters Omicron and Omega, for instance, were easy to confuse in some handwriting styles. Copying text accurately required not just literacy but sustained careful attention. The texts being copied ranged from simple, straightforward prose to complex poetry with metre and wordplay, from well-preserved recent manuscripts to ancient texts on deteriorating papyrus where portions were illegible. Easy texts could be copied quickly by less experienced scribes. Difficult texts required senior scribes with extensive experience and knowledge of literary conventions. Medical and scientific texts with specialized vocabulary needed scribes familiar with technical terminology. Copying Homer was different from copying Euclid, which was different from copying a historical chronicle. The library's copying operation needed scribes with various specializations and skill levels. Quality control was essential. Copied text needed to be checked against originals to catch errors. This checking process might involve reading the new copy aloud while someone followed along in the original, or comparing passages side by side. Errors would be marked for correction, words could be erased and rewritten, or corrections could be added between lines or in margins. Texts with too many errors might be discarded and recopied entirely, which was wasteful of expensive materials but necessary for maintaining quality. The library's reputation depended partly on the accuracy of its texts, so maintaining high copying standards was important. The physical organization of the copying operation required systems. Original manuscripts needed to be tracked, which texts were currently being copied, who had them, when they were due to be returned. New copies needed to be labelled with tags indicating what text they contained, who copied them, when the copying was done. Materials needed to be managed, papyrus supplies, ink supplies, pens that wore out and needed replacement. Work assignments needed to be coordinated, which scribes were working on, which texts, which copying rooms were occupied, which texts were highest priority. This required administrative oversight, probably involving senior librarians who managed the copying operation as part of their broader responsibilities. The environmental management of the library's storage areas was a constant concern. Papyrus is organic material made from plant fibers, and it's vulnerable to various forms of degradation. Humidity is the enemy. Too much moisture leads to mold growth that can destroy papyrus. But extreme dryness can make papyrus brittle and fragile. Egypt's climate was helpful in this regard, being generally dry, but Alexandria was on the coast where humidity levels varied. The library's storage areas needed to be ventilated to prevent moisture accumulation, but not so exposed to the elements that dust, insects and rain could damage texts. Scroll rotation was apparently part of the maintenance routine. Papyrus scrolls stored rolled up for long periods could develop permanent deformation, making them difficult to unroll and read later. Periodically unrolling scrolls, allowing them to lie flat or rolled in the opposite direction, helped prevent this. This rotation needed to be systematic. You couldn't just rotate whichever scrolls someone happened to think of. There needed to be schedules and records indicating which scrolls had been rotated when, ensuring that the entire collection got regular attention. This was tedious work with no intellectual glamour, but absolutely necessary for long-term preservation. Insect damage was a real threat. Various insects eat papyrus or make homes in scroll collections. Silverfish, beetles, moths, and other pests can destroy manuscripts. Prevention required vigilance, regular inspections of the collection looking for signs of infestation, fumigation when necessary, physical barriers to keep insects out of storage areas. If infestation was discovered, affected scrolls needed to be isolated to prevent spread, and damage needed to be assessed to determine whether texts could be saved through copying before they deteriorated further. The ancient equivalent of pest control was probably less effective than modern methods, which meant that preventing infestation was more important than treating it after it appeared. Fire was the catastrophic risk that everyone worried about but hopefully never experienced. With oil lamps providing lighting and with papyrus being flammable, the potential for fire was ever present. The library probably had strict rules about open flames, where lamps could be used, how they had to be managed, what precautions were required. There might have been some texts that were too valuable to risk exposing to lamplight at all, readable only during daylight hours when natural light eliminated the need for open flames. Water for firefighting would need to be available, though using water to fight a fire in a library creates its own problems, since water damages papyrus almost as badly as fire does. The ethics of citation and proper attribution was part of the scholarly culture at Alexandria, at least in principle. When scholars quoted other authors, they were supposed to acknowledge the source. When they borrowed ideas, they were supposed to credit the original thinker. This wasn't just scholarly courtesy, it was practical necessity for making scholarship useful. If you read a fascinating argument in one text and want to find out more, you need to know who originally made that argument so you can seek out their other works. Citation practices allowed knowledge to be traced back to its sources, creating networks of reference that help scholars navigate the intellectual landscape. Of course, ancient citation practices were inconsistent and sometimes sloppy by modern standards. There were no standardized citation formats, no footnotes or bibliographies in the modern sense. A scholar might mention an author's name when quoting them, or might just quote without attribution, expecting readers to recognize famous passages. Sometimes sources were cited inaccurately, either through honest error or through deliberate misattribution, to lend authority to dubious claims. The culture of citation existed, but it was informal and variable rather than systematized and enforced. Plagiarism was recognized as problematic, but enforcement was difficult. If someone copied another scholar's work and presented it as their own, how would you prove it? You'd need to demonstrate that the original work existed first, and that the plagiarist had access to it. In an era before printing, when manuscripts circulated in small numbers and dating them precisely was difficult, proving plagiarism was challenging. The main deterrent was probably reputation. Scholars who gained reputations for dishonesty would lose credibility, which in a small scholarly community could effectively end a career. But the lack of robust enforcement meant that plagiarism probably happened more often than we know. The daily rhythms of library work were structured around natural light and meal times. Morning work sessions when minds were fresh and light was good, breaks during the heat of the day, resuming work in the afternoon, stopping when daylight faded. Communal meals brought scholars and librarians together, providing opportunities for informal discussion about ongoing work. These meals were social occasions as well as nutrition. Relationships formed over shared food, collaborations emerged from casual conversations. Ideas were tested in friendly debate before being committed to formal writing. The social hierarchy within the library complex was probably complex and sometimes contested. Senior scholars had authority and prestige, but they depended on librarians to locate texts and on scribes to produce copies. Librarians had institutional knowledge and practical power over access to materials, but they served scholars rather than directing their own research programs. Scribes were essential workers, but had lower status than scholars and librarians. Maintenance workers were probably lowest in the hierarchy, but performed work without which the entire institution would fail. How these different groups interacted, whether relationships were cooperative or antagonistic, probably varied depending on personalities and circumstances. The work of maintaining catalogue records was ongoing. As new texts arrived, they needed to be catalogued, author identified, title recorded, physical condition noted, storage location assigned. As texts were copied, the copies needed catalogue entries separate from the originals. As texts were borrowed and returned, the circulation needed to be tracked. As texts degraded to the point of being unusable, they needed to be removed from the catalogue or marked as needing replacement copies. The catalogue was a living document, constantly updated to reflect the current state of the collection. Different types of texts required different handling protocols. Valuable rare originals would be consulted only by senior scholars and only under supervision. Common texts with multiple copies available could circulate more freely. Fragile texts needed special care in handling. Large texts spanning many scrolls needed all volumes to be available together for readers working through them sequentially. Reference texts that many scholars might need simultaneously might need to be copied in multiple versions to meet demand. The library's lending policies had to balance access, making texts available to scholars who needed them, with preservation, ensuring texts weren't damaged or lost through careless use. The working conditions in the library complex were probably reasonably pleasant by ancient standards. The royal quarter provided a privileged environment, shielded from the worst noise, smell and chaos of the city's commercial districts. There were gardens for walking and thinking, fountains for cooling the air, shaded porticos for working during hot weather. This wasn't a grim industrial workplace. This was a place designed to facilitate intellectual work, which meant making it physically comfortable enough that scholars could focus on ideas rather than being distracted by discomfort. But let's not romanticize it too much. These were still ancient working conditions, which meant no climate control beyond architecture and shade, no electric lighting, no ergonomic furniture designed to prevent back strain from long periods of sitting. The air quality inside the library storage areas was probably not great. Dust from papyrus, smoke from occasional oil lamps, limited ventilation in some interior rooms. The noise level varied. Copying rooms where scribes worked in silence, punctuated by occasional quiet discussion, versus reading rooms where scholars might be discussing texts with students or colleagues, versus administrative areas where librarians managed logistics. The training of new scribes and librarians required experienced workers to pass on practical knowledge. How do you prepare papyrus for optimal writing conditions? How do you mix ink to the right consistency? How do you identify different handwriting styles to date manuscripts? How do you organize storage areas for efficient retrieval? How do you handle fragile texts without causing damage? All of this was craft knowledge, learned through demonstration and practice rather than from written manuals. The library needed to maintain this craft knowledge across generations of workers, which required deliberate training programs and probably some form of apprenticeship system. The relationship between the library and the broader city of Alexandria involved various interactions. Scholars might give public lectures or demonstrations, bringing library resources to wider audiences. Wealthy citizens might donate texts to the collection, either to gain prestige or to ensure preservation of works they valued. The library might be consulted for information needed by the city government or by commercial interests, historical precedents for legal disputes, technical information for building projects, geographic knowledge for trade ventures. The library wasn't completely isolated within the royal quarter. It had connections to and influences on the broader urban community. The linguistic diversity of Alexandria meant that library workers needed to navigate multiple languages daily. Greek was the primary language of scholarship and administration, but Egyptian was spoken by much of the population, Hebrew by the Jewish community, Aramaic in some communities, and various other languages by merchants and visitors from distant regions. Librarians dealing with non-Greek texts needed at least basic knowledge of those languages to catalogue them properly. Translators obviously needed fluency in multiple languages. Even scholars working primarily with Greek texts might need to consult non-Greek sources occasionally, requiring either personal language skills or assistance from specialists. The economic value of the library's collection was substantial but difficult to quantify. Individual manuscripts had market value that depended on rarity, content, and condition. But the collection's value as a whole exceeded the sum of individual manuscripts' values. It was the comprehensiveness, the organization, the accessibility that made the library uniquely valuable. This value was primarily cultural and intellectual rather than commercial, but it translated indirectly into economic benefits through Alexandria's reputation as an intellectual center, which attracted scholars, students, and visitors who contributed to the local economy. The copying operation generated revenue as well as consuming it. Copies produced at the library could be sold to other libraries, to private collectors, to educational institutions elsewhere in the Mediterranean world. The library had advantages in copy production, access to the best originals, skilled scribes, quality control systems that meant Alexandrian copies commanded premium prices. This revenue didn't make the library self-supporting. Royal funding was still essential, but it probably offset some operational costs and demonstrated that the institution generated value beyond just consuming resources. The physical wear and tear on manuscripts from regular use meant that popular texts needed to be recopied periodically, even when no new acquisitions were involved. Homer's epics were consulted constantly, which meant the library's copies wore out and needed replacement more frequently than obscure texts that rarely left the shelves. This created a kind of natural selection in the collection. Frequently used texts were maintained through regular recopying, while rarely consulted texts might gradually deteriorate without anyone noticing until someone finally requested them and discovered they were no longer readable. Preservation effort naturally concentrated on texts that people actually wanted to read, which makes sense but also meant that less popular texts were more vulnerable to loss. The relationship between theory and practice in librarianship was similar to the relationship in science that we discussed earlier. Librarians developed practical knowledge about organizing collections, managing circulation, preserving materials, knowledge that was grounded in direct experience with what worked and what didn't. But this practical knowledge could be informed by theoretical principles about classification, about the relationships between different types of texts, about the nature of knowledge itself. The library wasn't just a warehouse with shelves. It embodied ideas about how knowledge should be organized and accessed, even if those ideas were often implicit rather than explicitly theorized. Let's talk about what happened when things went wrong, because systems don't run perfectly, and the historical record occasionally preserves information about problems and failures. Texts went missing, borrowed and never returned, misfiled and lost in the collection, stolen by dishonest borrowers or corrupt staff. Copies contained errors that weren't caught during quality control, which meant flawed texts entered circulation. Storage areas developed problems, leaks that damaged manuscripts, pest infestations that destroyed sections of the collection, structural issues that made rooms unsafe or unusable. Staff made mistakes, committed fraud, had conflicts with each other that disrupted operations. The institution survived these problems through redundancy and resilience, multiple copies of important texts, systematic checking procedures, maintenance protocols, administrative oversight, but problems were inevitable. The succession of library directors over time brought changes in priorities and management approaches. Some directors focused on expanding the collection, sending out agents to acquire new texts aggressively. Others focused on organizing what already existed, improving cataloging and access systems. Some emphasized scholarly work, supporting research and critical editions. Others emphasized service, making the collection more accessible to users beyond the core scholarly community. These shifting priorities reflected both the director's personal interests and the broader political and cultural context, what the ruling Ptolemy valued, what resources were available, what challenges the institution faced. The aging of the institution over centuries created its own challenges. The first generation of library workers built systems and established practices. The second generation maintained those systems while gradually modifying them based on experience. Subsequent generations inherited increasingly complex systems with accumulated traditions that might or might not still make sense. Institutional knowledge became embedded in practices that people followed because, quote, 28, even when the original reasons were forgotten. Reform required overcoming institutional inertia, convincing people that change was necessary despite the comfort of established routines. The library's success created imitators and competitors, which was both flattering and challenging. Other Hellenistic kingdoms built their own libraries, trying to replicate Alexandria's cultural prestige. Pergamum's library became a serious rival, collecting aggressively and attracting scholars with generous stipends. These competing institutions drove up the cost of acquiring texts and hiring scholars, making it more expensive for Alexandria to maintain its advantages. But competition also validated Alexandria's model, demonstrating that the concept of the state-supported research library was valuable enough for others to imitate. The integration of the library into the broader museum complex meant that boundaries between different types of intellectual work were permeable. A scholar working primarily on textual criticism might also contribute to geographic knowledge by analysing travel accounts mentioned in literary texts. A mathematician might write commentaries on astronomical poetry. A physician might compile medical knowledge from texts across multiple traditions. The library provided the textual resources, the museum provided the institutional support and scholarly community, and the combination enabled work that crossed traditional disciplinary boundaries. One final observation about the daily life of the library. It was fundamentally an act of faith in the future. Every scroll carefully preserved, every catalogue entry meticulously recorded, every copy produced with attention to accuracy. All of this work was done with the assumption that future scholars would need and value this knowledge. The copyists and librarians couldn't know which texts would prove important centuries later. They couldn't predict which ideas would influence future thinkers. They preserved broadly, maintained comprehensively on the faith that someone, sometime, would be grateful for their diligence. And for the texts that did survive the centuries, that faith was justified. The countless hours of unglamorous labour, checking catalogue entries, rotating scrolls, hunting insects, copying manuscripts, made it possible for ancient knowledge to reach us. Not all the knowledge, unfortunately, but enough to demonstrate what was lost and enough to shape everything that came after. That's the real legacy of Alexandria's daily work. Not the moments of genius, but the sustained institutional commitment to preservation that meant some of that genius could be transmitted across the millennia to eventually reach us, still arguing about which reading is authentic and still grateful that someone, somewhere, cared enough to maintain the text so we could have this argument at all. The golden age of Alexandria's intellectual life couldn't last forever, because golden ages never do. Institutions that depend on royal patronage are vulnerable to changes in royal priorities, and the Ptolemaic dynasty, which had started strong with capable rulers who valued scholarship, gradually declined into the kind of dysfunction that Hellenistic monarchies specialized in: family feuds, murders, coups, and generally the sort of palace intrigue that makes for entertaining historical drama, but terrible working conditions for scholars trying to do research. The museum and library survived this decline for a surprisingly long time, but they couldn't remain unaffected when the dynasty funding them became increasingly violent and unstable. The shift began subtly in the late 3rd century BCE. The first three Ptolemies, Ptolemy I, the second and the third, had been genuinely interested in intellectual pursuits and willing to fund scholarship generously. They understood that cultural prestige enhanced their political legitimacy and that knowledge had practical value. Their successors were more variable in their commitment to scholarship. Some continued the patronage tradition, others were more interested in other priorities, and increasingly the court became a dangerous place where political loyalty mattered more than intellectual achievement. When your continued employment depends on staying in the good graces of a monarch who might murder family members over dinner disagreements, academic freedom becomes somewhat theoretical. The court purges that periodically swept through the Ptolemaic palace affected the museum because the museum was located in the royal quarter and its members were royal employees. When a new Ptolemy took power through violence, which happened with distressing frequency in the later dynasty, there might be a settling of scores that extended to scholars perceived as too close to the previous ruler or the losing faction in court struggles. Scholars found themselves needing to demonstrate political loyalty in ways that had nothing to do with their research competence. Being the best textual critic in the Mediterranean world was great, but it didn't protect you if you'd been too friendly with the wrong prince, or had said something that could be interpreted as disrespectful to the new ruler. Aristarchus of Samothrace, that brilliant textual critic we discussed earlier, apparently left Alexandria during one of these political crises in the mid-2nd century BCE. The exact circumstances aren't entirely clear from surviving sources, but Aristarchus ended up in Cyprus, which was a Ptolemaic possession but far from the dangers of the court in Alexandria. This wasn't a voluntary career move to explore new opportunities. This was getting out of Alexandria because staying seemed unsafe. When your leading scholar feels compelled to flee to avoid political violence, that's a pretty clear sign that the intellectual environment has deteriorated. Aristarchus wasn't the only scholar to leave. The pattern of scholars departing Alexandria for safer or more welcoming environments became increasingly common as the 2nd century BCE progressed. Some went to other Hellenistic kingdoms with more stable patronage. Some went to Rome, which was becoming a major power and was interested in importing Greek culture, including Greek scholars. Some returned to their home cities. The brain drain was gradual rather than sudden. It wasn't like everyone left at once. But over time, the concentration of first-rate scholars at Alexandria diminished. The museum continued to exist and continued to attract some scholars, but it was no longer obviously the best place to be if you were an ambitious intellectual. The nickname __quote _29 _ apparently belonged to a scholar named Didymus, who worked at Alexandria during the 1st century BCE, long after the museum's peak. Didymus was extraordinarily prolific, reportedly writing somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000 books, though ancient books were papyrus scrolls that might be shorter than modern chapters, so this isn't quite as overwhelming as it sounds. Still, that's an impressive output. The nickname Brazen Guts apparently referred to his tireless capacity for work, his ability to keep producing scholarship year after year, but Didymus's work was primarily commentaries on earlier scholars rather than original research. He compiled, summarized, and explained the work of previous generations. This was valuable work. It preserved knowledge and made earlier scholarship accessible, but it represented a shift from pioneering research to scholarly consolidation. This shift from discovery to commentary characterized later Alexandrian scholarship more broadly. The great advances of the 3rd century BCE, Euclid's systematization of geometry, Eratosthenes' geographic and mathematical work, Herophilus's anatomical discoveries, Aristarchus's textual criticism, gave way to commentary, compilation, and preservation of earlier achievements. Later scholars wrote about what earlier scholars had discovered rather than making new discoveries themselves. This wasn't because later scholars were less intelligent or less capable. It was because the institutional conditions that had made the earlier discoveries possible had changed. Funding was less reliable, political stability was gone, the community of scholars was smaller and less collaborative, and the ambitious young minds who might have come to Alexandria were going elsewhere. The quality of library directors became increasingly tied to court politics rather than to scholarly achievement. Early directors had been chosen for their intellectual credentials: Zenodotus, Eratosthenes, Aristophanes of Byzantium, Aristarchus. These were leading scholars whose appointments made sense based on their scholarship. Later appointments were more political, chosen based on connections to the royal family or court factions rather than scholarly merit. When administrative positions become patronage appointments rather than merit-based selections, institutional quality suffers. A mediocre scholar with good political connections might become library director, while more capable scholars were passed over because they lacked court influence or belonged to the wrong faction. This doesn't mean all later directors were incompetent. Some were genuinely accomplished scholars who also happened to have political connections. But the increasing emphasis on political loyalty over intellectual achievement changed the institution's character. Scholars had to spend energy on court politics that might otherwise go into research. They had to be careful about what they said and wrote, avoiding anything that might be interpreted as politically problematic. Academic freedom requires some insulation from political pressure, and that insulation was eroding as the Ptolemaic dynasty declined. Rome's growing involvement in the Eastern Mediterranean affected Alexandria in complex ways. The Ptolemies became increasingly dependent on Roman support to maintain their throne, which meant Roman interests became factors in Ptolemaic decision-making. Roman aristocrats began visiting Alexandria as tourists and students, bringing their own cultural attitudes and expectations. Some Romans appreciated Greek scholarship and supported it generously. Others viewed Greeks as conquered subjects whose intellectual achievements were interesting curiosities, rather than vital knowledge worth supporting. The cultural dynamic shifted as Egypt moved from being an independent power to being a client state to, eventually, being a Roman province. Let's talk about the fire that occurred during Julius Caesar's visit to Alexandria in 48 BCE, because this is one of those historical events that's been mythologized to the point where separating fact from legend is challenging. Caesar arrived in Alexandria pursuing his rival Pompey, who had fled there after losing a civil war battle. Caesar got involved in the Ptolemaic dynastic dispute between Cleopatra VII and her brother Ptolemy XIII, sided with Cleopatra, and ended up besieged in the palace quarter by hostile Egyptian forces. During the fighting, fires broke out in the harbour area. These fires destroyed warehouses containing scrolls, either scrolls waiting to be transported elsewhere, or scrolls that had been stored in harbour warehouses for logistical reasons, or possibly books that had been confiscated from ships as part of the library's aggressive acquisition strategy and hadn't yet been moved to the main library. The scale of the destruction is debated. Ancient sources give different numbers, and they're probably not entirely reliable. Some sources claim 400,000 scrolls were destroyed, others give different figures, some don't mention the library at all in connection with Caesar's fire. Modern historians argue about whether the main library collection was affected, or whether only warehouse storage was destroyed. The most likely scenario is that substantial numbers of scrolls were lost in the harbour warehouses, but the main library in the royal quarter was not directly burned. This was still a significant loss. Tens of thousands of texts destroyed, including possibly unique copies of works that were never replaced. But it wasn't the total destruction of the library that popular imagination sometimes suggests. What's striking about this incident is that the library survived it and continued functioning. The institution was resilient enough that even major losses didn't shut it down. There were apparently donations of texts to replace what was lost. Mark Antony supposedly gave Cleopatra 200,000 scrolls from the Library of Pergamum, though this story is also debated and might be propaganda or legend. Whether or not that specific donation happened, the library clearly continued to acquire texts and serve scholars after Caesar's fire. The institution had been damaged but not destroyed. which suggests that its value was recognized enough that efforts were made to restore it. The Roman imperial period brought changes to Alexandria's scholarly life. Augustus, who became the first Roman emperor after defeating Antony and Cleopatra, recognized Alexandria's importance and maintained some level of support for its intellectual institutions. But the center of gravity in the Mediterranean world had shifted to Rome. Wealth and power were now concentrated in Italy rather than Egypt. Ambitious scholars increasingly looked to Rome for patronage rather than Alexandria. The museum continued to exist, but it was no longer the preeminent intellectual center of the Mediterranean world. Roman-era Alexandria developed a different scholarly character. There was still important work being done. Hero of Alexandria's engineering treatises date from this period, and there were significant scholars working on mathematical, astronomical, and medical problems. But the scale of institutional support was reduced. The comprehensive ambition of the early Ptolemaic period, to collect all books, to solve all problems, to achieve universal knowledge, gave way to more modest goals. Scholarship became more distributed, with important work happening in multiple cities rather than concentrated in Alexandria. This distribution was probably healthier in the long run, creating intellectual resilience through geographic diversity, but it meant Alexandria was no longer uniquely important. The library's collection was probably dispersed somewhat during this period. Copies of important texts had been made for libraries in other cities throughout the Hellenistic period, so major works existed in multiple locations. Scholars travelling between cities carried texts with them, spreading the collection. The Serapeum Library, which we've mentioned briefly, became increasingly important as a secondary centre of learning in Alexandria, possibly absorbing some functions that the main library had originally served. The neat distinction between the main library and the royal quarter and the Serapeum Library probably blurred over time, with both serving as resources for scholarship. Let's talk about how knowledge dissemination worked in the absence of printing, because this is crucial to understanding how texts survived, or didn't survive, the various disasters that affected Alexandria. When a text existed in multiple copies in multiple locations, the loss of one copy, even the loss of many copies in a single disaster, didn't necessarily mean the text was lost permanently. As long as copies survived elsewhere, the text could be recopied and redistributed. But when a text existed in only one or a few copies, all in the same location, a fire or military destruction could permanently erase it from the historical record. The texts that survived from antiquity to the present are the ones that were popular enough or important enough to be copied many times and distributed widely. This creates a selection bias in what we know about ancient knowledge. Popular texts like Homer's epics survived in many copies and were never at serious risk of total loss. Important reference works like Euclid's Elements were copied extensively because they were useful, so they survived. But obscure works, specialized treatises, minor authors, local histories, technical manuals for crafts that fell out of use, all of these were more vulnerable to loss. A disaster that destroyed even a fraction of Alexandria's collection might have eliminated the only surviving copies of numerous works, permanently removing them from human knowledge. We can't know what we've lost because we've lost it, which is one of those frustrating historical realities that keeps historians awake at night. The Roman period also saw Alexandria become more cosmopolitan in certain ways and more culturally complex. Christianity was growing as a religious movement, and Alexandria became an important centre of early Christian theology. Jewish scholarship continued, with the Alexandrian Jewish community maintaining its own intellectual traditions. Greek philosophy continued to be studied and taught. Egyptian traditional culture persisted despite centuries of Greek and now Roman rule. These different intellectual and religious traditions coexisted in the same city, sometimes influencing each other, sometimes in conflict, creating a complex cultural environment quite different from the more purely Greek intellectual culture of the early Ptolemaic period. The museum as an institution probably continued in some form into the Roman period, though the evidence is fragmentary, and historians debate exactly what survived and in what form. Some scholars argue the museum effectively ended with the Ptolemaic dynasty, and what continued was something different. Others argue for institutional continuity with gradual changes in function and character. What's clear is that Alexandria remained an important intellectual centre, even after losing its status as a royal capital of an independent kingdom. The city's libraries, schools, and scholarly community continued to attract students and scholars, just not at the same scale or with the same level of institutional support as during the Ptolemaic Golden Age. One thing that changed was the relationship between scholarship and power. Under the Ptolemies, the museum was a royal institution, directly funded and controlled by the monarchy. Under Roman rule, scholarly institutions had more varied funding sources. Wealthy individuals might endow schools or libraries, religious institutions might support scholarship, cities might provide some funding, private scholars might support themselves through teaching. This diversification of funding reduced dependence on any single patron, but also meant less concentrated resources. Instead of one extremely wealthy institution, there were many modestly funded ones, which changed the character of scholarly work. The expectation that scholars would produce practical benefits for their patrons probably increased during the Roman period. Roman culture valued practical knowledge, engineering, military technology, agriculture, medicine, law, more than abstract philosophy or pure mathematics. Scholars who could offer useful knowledge found patronage more easily than those working on purely theoretical problems. This wasn't an absolute shift. Abstract scholarship continued, but the balance tilted somewhat toward the applied end of the spectrum. Hero of Alexandria's work, with its emphasis on practical devices and engineering applications, fits this pattern well. The teaching function of Alexandria's scholarly community became relatively more important compared to research. During the museum's peak, research was primary, and teaching was secondary. Scholars were paid to do research and might choose to teach but weren't required to. As institutional support for pure research declined, scholars increasingly supported themselves through teaching, taking students who paid fees. This shift from research-focused to teaching-focused scholarship changed what got emphasized. Teaching requires presenting existing knowledge clearly and systematically. Research requires pushing beyond existing knowledge. Both are valuable, but they're different activities with different priorities. Let's acknowledge the material losses that accumulated over the Roman period and beyond. Fires, floods, civil unrest, military actions, simple neglect and decay. All of these gradually eroded the collection. Each disaster might destroy some portion of the texts, and not everything destroyed would be replaced. The library of the early Ptolemaic period, with its hundreds of thousands of scrolls and its comprehensive ambition, was gradually reduced. What survived into late antiquity was probably a fraction of what had once existed, though still a substantial collection by the standards of most other libraries. The question of when the Library of Alexandria ended doesn't have a simple answer, because the decline was gradual rather than sudden. There wasn't a single moment when the library ceased to exist. Instead, there was a long process of decline with occasional disasters accelerating the process. Caesar's fire in 48 BCE damaged but didn't destroy the institution. Later fires and conflicts caused additional damage. Aurelian's destruction of parts of Alexandria in 272 CE during civil wars apparently damaged the Brucheium quarter, where the main library had been located, possibly destroying whatever remained of the original collection. Diocletian's siege of Alexandria in 297 CE caused more destruction. The institution that had once been the greatest library in the world was by the 4th century CE either gone entirely or reduced to a shadow of its former self. The Serapeum library survived longer than the main library, functioning as Alexandria's main scholarly library into the late 4th century CE. The Serapeum temple was a functioning religious site with an attached library that served scholars and students. But religious politics would doom it. In 391 CE, the Roman Emperor Theodosius issued edicts against pagan temples, and the Serapeum was destroyed by Christian mobs with official sanction. Ancient sources disagree about whether the library was destroyed along with the temple. Some accounts suggest the books were saved, others suggest they were destroyed, still others don't mention the library at all. Whatever the truth, the Serapeum's destruction ended any institutional continuity with Alexandria's classical scholarly tradition. The loss of the Library of Alexandria has become a symbol of lost knowledge, cultural destruction, and the fragility of human achievement. It's become somewhat mythologized. Popular imagination tends to picture a single catastrophic fire that destroyed everything in one terrible moment, preferably with barbarians or fanatics deliberately burning books. The reality was more complicated and gradual. Multiple disasters over centuries, changing political conditions, shifting priorities, economic decline, religious conflict, simple neglect. All of these contributed to the loss. There probably wasn't a day when the last book burned and someone said, well, that's the end of the Library of Alexandria. Instead, there was a slow fading as the institution became less important, less well-funded, less capable of maintaining its collection, until eventually there wasn't enough left to meaningfully call it the Library of Alexandria anymore. But here's the important point that often gets lost in the lamentations about what was destroyed. A huge amount of what Alexandria preserved did survive, just not in Alexandria. The copying programs, the distribution of texts to other libraries, the scholars who carried books with them when they travelled, the students who copied texts to take home, all of these meant that Alexandria's knowledge spread throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. When texts were lost in Alexandria, copies might survive in Constantinople, or Rome, or Antioch, or Pergamum. Later, Islamic scholars working in Baghdad and other cities translated Greek scientific and philosophical texts into Arabic, preserving knowledge that had been lost in the Greek-speaking world. Medieval European monasteries preserved other texts through their copying programs. The transmission chain was fragile and broken in many places. The majority of ancient literature has been lost. No question about that. But what survived did so partly because Alexandria had distributed copies widely during its peak centuries. The Library of Alexandria didn't preserve ancient knowledge by keeping it locked in one location. It preserved ancient knowledge by systematically copying it, cataloguing it, studying it, and disseminating it. The institution failed, but the mission partially succeeded because the knowledge had already spread beyond any single institution's fate. Alexandria's scholarly community continued in various forms even after the classical institutions were gone. There were still schools, still teachers, still students studying classical texts. Hypatia, the mathematician and philosopher who was murdered by a Christian mob in 415 CE, was teaching in Alexandria long after the main library was gone, demonstrating that intellectual life persisted even when the grand institutional framework had crumbled. The city remained culturally important, though never again achieving the preeminence it had held during the Ptolemaic period. The Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century CE brought new cultural influences and eventually new scholarly traditions. The legend that the conquering Arab general burned the library to heat bathwater, if the books agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary. If they disagree, they are heretical, is almost certainly false, a story invented centuries later. By the time of the Arab conquest, the classical library had been gone for centuries, but the legend's persistence shows how the Library of Alexandria had become symbolic, representing lost knowledge and the conflict between different civilizations or religions, even when the actual historical circumstances were more complex and less dramatic. What did Alexandria prove? That institutional support for knowledge production works, that bringing diverse scholars together creates intellectual synergy, that systematic collecting and preservation can accumulate knowledge at a scale impossible for individuals, that the pursuit of comprehensive understanding, even if ultimately unachievable, produces valuable results. That knowledge, once created and properly disseminated, is more durable than any single library or any single institution. The Library of Alexandria failed as a physical institution, but succeeded as a model, a demonstration of what's possible when societies decide that knowledge is valuable enough to invest in systematically. The romantic appeal of the lost library, the might-have-beens, the vanished books, the knowledge we'll never recover, is understandable. We'll never read the lost plays of Sophocles, the complete works of Sappho, the technical treatises that explained forgotten manufacturing techniques, the histories that recorded events now unknown. That's genuinely lamentable, but focusing only on what was lost risks missing what was preserved and what was learned. Alexandria showed that knowledge could be organized, that texts could be edited and improved, that different disciplines could inform each other, that research could be systematic rather than haphazard. These lessons survived even when the books didn't. The Library of Alexandria was never perfect. It was built on an exploitative economy. It served an autocratic dynasty. It excluded most of humanity from its benefits. It contained selection biases and cultural prejudices. But it was also a genuine achievement. An institution that advanced human knowledge and created methods that would echo through subsequent centuries. When modern librarians catalogue books, when scholars edit texts, when universities bring together researchers from different fields, When governments fund basic research, Alexandria's influence is present. The building burned, the dynasty fell, the collection dispersed, but the idea survived. And sometimes, the idea is more important than any physical manifestation of it, which is perhaps appropriate for an institution that was ultimately about ideas and knowledge, rather than about buildings and papyrus rolls. The story of Alexandria's decline is ultimately about the fragility of institutions and the resilience of knowledge. Institutions depend on continued support, stable conditions, sustained commitment, all of which can evaporate quickly when political or economic circumstances change. Knowledge, once created and properly disseminated, is more durable because it doesn't depend on any single location or institution. It can be copied, transmitted, translated, reimagined. It can survive the destruction of the libraries that once held it, preserved in unexpected places by people who recognized its value even when others didn't. That's the real legacy of Alexandria. Not the books that burned, but the knowledge that survived because Alexandria had spread it widely enough that no single disaster could destroy it completely. The library died, but what it taught the world about how to preserve and transmit knowledge lived on, which is probably the best kind of immortality an institution dedicated to knowledge could hope for. We need to talk more about the Serapeum, because while everyone focuses on the main library in the royal quarter, the one that Caesar's fire damaged and subsequent disasters gradually destroyed, the Serapeum Library became increasingly important as a secondary scholarly centre, particularly as the main institution declined. The Serapeum was both a temple complex dedicated to Serapis, that syncretic deity the early Ptolemies had invented to bridge Greek and Egyptian religious traditions, and also a major library and scholarly centre. It was located on a hill in the western part of the city, outside the royal quarter, which gave it a somewhat different character from the more exclusive main library. The Serapeum's library probably started as a secondary collection, a place where duplicate copies might be stored, or where texts that didn't fit in the main library could be housed. But over time, especially during the Roman period when the main library's status was declining, the Serapeum became more important as a functioning scholarly institution. It was accessible to a broader range of users, not just the elite scholars of the museum, but also students, visiting scholars, and probably local Alexandrians who wanted access to texts for various purposes. The temple setting gave it a different atmosphere from the royal quarter's institutional formality. This was sacred space that also happened to be educational space, combining religious and intellectual functions in ways that were common in the ancient world. The Serapeum's architecture was apparently impressive. Ancient sources describe a large temple complex with columned halls, reading rooms, storage areas for scrolls, and spaces for lectures and discussions. The temple itself was elaborate, with the cult statue of Serapis reportedly magnificent and imposing. The whole complex sat on elevated ground, visible from much of the city, making it both a physical and symbolic landmark. This wasn't a modest neighbourhood library. This was a major institution designed to impress and to serve multiple functions simultaneously. Scholars working at the Serapeum during the late Roman period were maintaining traditions of textual criticism, commentary, and teaching that had been established centuries earlier at the main museum and library. They were editing texts, writing commentaries, copying manuscripts, teaching students, all the activities that Alexandria had been known for, continuing even as the original institutional framework crumbled. This continuity is important because it demonstrates that intellectual traditions can outlast specific institutions. The method survived even when the buildings and political structures that had initially supported them changed or disappeared. The religious context of the Serapeum became problematic as Christianity gained power in the Roman Empire. Constantine's conversion and his successors' increasing support for Christianity created tensions with traditional pagan religious institutions. Temples that had functioned for centuries suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of imperial religious policy. The Serapeum, as one of the most prominent pagan temples in Alexandria, became a target for Christian opposition. There were probably economic factors too. Temple properties were valuable, and redirecting those resources to Christian institutions was both ideologically satisfying and financially beneficial for those doing the redirecting. The situation escalated in 391 CE when Emperor Theodosius issued edicts against pagan temples. In Alexandria, the Christian bishop Theophilus led the charge against pagan institutions, and the Serapeum was a prime target. A Christian mob, with official sanction and possibly official participation, attacked and destroyed the temple. The destruction was thorough. The building was demolished. The cult statue was destroyed. The sacred space was desecrated. This wasn't accidental damage from civil unrest. This was deliberate destruction of a religious site by people who viewed it as representing false religion that needed to be eliminated. What happened to the library during this destruction is one of those historical questions where sources disagree and modern historians argue. Some ancient accounts suggest the library was saved, that the books were removed before or during the destruction and preserved elsewhere. Other accounts suggest the library was destroyed along with the temple, the books burned or scattered. Still other sources don't mention the library at all when describing the temple's destruction, which might mean the library wasn't significant enough to warrant mention, or might mean it had already declined to the point of being barely functional, or might just mean those particular sources weren't interested in libraries. The most likely scenario, piecing together fragmentary evidence, is that the library had already been declining for years before 391, that its collection was probably smaller and less important than it had been in earlier centuries, and that whatever remained was probably lost during the temple's destruction. Even if some books were saved, the institution was finished. You can't function as a library without a building, without institutional support, without funding for staff and maintenance. The destruction of the Serapeum ended the last remnant of Alexandria's classical library tradition, closing a chapter that had been slowly closing for centuries. The violence of the Serapeum's destruction reflects the religious conflicts of late antiquity, when Christianity's rise often involved the suppression of traditional religious practices. Modern sensibilities tend to view this destruction as cultural vandalism, the loss of knowledge, the destruction of heritage, the triumph of fanaticism over learning. That's a valid perspective, but it's worth understanding that from the Christian perspective of the time, this was removing false religion and reclaiming space for the true faith. The Serapeum wasn't just a library, it was a major pagan temple, and its destruction was part of a broader campaign against paganism that Christian authorities viewed as spiritually necessary. This doesn't excuse the destruction of knowledge, but it helps explain why it happened. People rarely destroy books because they hate knowledge in the abstract. They destroy books because those particular books represent ideas they find threatening or wrong. The Serapeum's library was collateral damage in a religious conflict, destroyed not because anyone specifically opposed literacy or scholarship, but because the institution housing the library was a pagan temple that Christian authorities wanted eliminated. The books were incidental to the main goal, which was ending pagan worship at a prominent sacred site. Let's step back and trace the broader pattern of how Alexandria's knowledge dispersed across the Mediterranean world and beyond, because this is where the story becomes less about loss and more about transmission. The Library of Alexandria's importance wasn't ultimately in preserving texts in one location. That strategy, as we've seen, was vulnerable to disasters. The library's real importance was in copying texts, distributing them, training scholars in methods of textual criticism and scholarly organization, and creating intellectual networks that spread Alexandrian approaches to knowledge throughout the ancient world. Pergamum, which we've mentioned several times, developed its library partly in competition with Alexandria, but that competition meant Pergamum was copying and collecting many of the same texts. When a text existed in both Alexandria and Pergamum, the loss of one copy didn't mean the text was lost entirely. Pergamum's library eventually came under Roman control, and its contents were apparently given to Cleopatra by Mark Antony, or so the story goes, though historians debate its accuracy. But whether or not that specific transfer happened, Pergamum's collection contributed to the broader Mediterranean textual network. Rhodes, that prosperous island city-state, had scholarly institutions and libraries that attracted students and scholars. Rhodes was known for rhetoric and philosophy, and its schools maintained substantial collections of texts. Scholars moved between Alexandria, Rhodes, and other intellectual centres, carrying knowledge and texts with them. A student who studied at Alexandria might return to Rhodes to teach, bringing Alexandrian methods and copies of Alexandrian texts. These personal networks created redundancy in the textual transmission system. Antioch, capital of the Seleucid Empire and later an important Roman city, developed its own scholarly culture with libraries and schools. The intellectual rivalry between different Hellenistic kingdoms meant that each major capital wanted to demonstrate cultural sophistication by supporting scholarship. which meant building libraries and attracting scholars. This competitive dynamic ensured that important texts existed in multiple locations, distributed across different political jurisdictions. When one library suffered disaster, others preserved what was lost. Constantinople, which became the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire and eventually the Byzantine Empire, inherited much of the Greek intellectual tradition. Byzantine scholars preserved Greek texts, copied manuscripts, maintained the tradition of textual criticism and commentary. The Byzantine Empire's survival for 1,000 years after the Western Roman Empire fell meant that Greek classical culture had institutional support continuing into the medieval period, keeping texts alive that might otherwise have been lost. Byzantine libraries and scriptoria, copying centres in monasteries and palaces, maintained manuscripts that would eventually be rediscovered by Renaissance humanists and become the foundation for modern classical scholarship. The Syriac translation movement deserves special attention because it was crucial to preserving Greek scientific and philosophical texts. Christian communities in Syria and Mesopotamia translated Greek texts into Syriac, a Semitic language related to Aramaic during late antiquity and the early medieval period. These translations preserved works that would later be translated again, this time from Syriac into Arabic. The Syriac scholars weren't just passively translating, they were actively engaging with Greek philosophy and science, writing commentaries, developing their own interpretations. This intellectual engagement meant the content was understood and valued, not just mechanically copied. The Islamic Golden Age, centered in Baghdad but extending across the Islamic world from Spain to Central Asia, saw a massive translation movement that brought Greek scientific and philosophical texts into Arabic. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established in the 9th century CE, functioned somewhat like Alexandria's museum had centuries earlier, a state-funded institution bringing together scholars to translate, study, and extend knowledge. Scholars working in Baghdad translated Euclid, Ptolemy, Galen, Aristotle, and many other Greek authors whose works had been preserved through the Syriac transmission chain or in Byzantine libraries. These Arabic translations preserved texts that had been lost in the Greek-speaking world. During the medieval period, when Western Europe had limited access to classical texts and Byzantine culture was struggling with various pressures, Islamic scholars were studying, translating, and building on Greek foundations. Islamic mathematicians advanced algebra and trigonometry, building on Greek geometric foundations. Islamic astronomers refined Ptolemaic astronomical models. Islamic physicians developed Galenic medicine further. This wasn't just preservation, this was active scholarship that extended and transformed the knowledge it preserved. The transmission route from Greek to Syriac to Arabic to Latin, which eventually brought Greek learning back to Western Europe, was circuitous and inefficient, involving multiple translation steps and centuries of delay. But it worked. Knowledge that originated in Alexandria, that was copied and distributed during the Hellenistic period, that survived in Byzantine and Syriac versions during late antiquity, that was translated into Arabic during the Islamic Golden Age, eventually returned to Europe through translations from Arabic into Latin during the 12th and 13th centuries. European scholars encountered Aristotle and Euclid through these translation chains, often without knowing the complex transmission history behind the texts they were studying. The Alexandrian techniques for reading and studying texts, careful comparison of manuscripts, attention to textual variants, systematic commentary, biographical context, critical judgment about authenticity. These methods survived and evolved through these transmission chains. Byzantine scholars maintained many Alexandrian scholarly practices. Islamic scholars developed sophisticated textual criticism in their work on religious texts and their engagement with Greek philosophy. Medieval European universities, when they eventually developed, adopted similar approaches to textual study, though they didn't always know they were following patterns established centuries earlier at Alexandria. Let's talk about what was lost despite these transmission networks, because the survival story shouldn't obscure the magnitude of the losses. Most ancient literature is gone. Of the Greek tragic playwrights, we have complete plays from only 3, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, and we have all their plays only because Byzantine scholars selected them for preservation. We know the names of many other tragic playwrights and have fragments quoted by other authors, but their complete works are lost. We have extensive Greek lyric poetry and fragments, but lack most complete works. We have mentions of scientific and technical treatises that would be fascinating to read, but that didn't survive. The list of lost works is depressingly long. The selection of what survived wasn't random, but it also wasn't necessarily based on quality or importance by objective standards. Some texts survived because they were useful for Christian education or theology. Some survived because they were used in teaching, so they got copied frequently. Some survived because a particular scholar or monastery took interest in preserving them. Some survived through sheer luck. The only copy happened to be in a library that didn't burn, or happened to be copied at a moment when that text was fashionable. The ancient library of which we have the best survival rate is probably Roman comedy, and that's partly because medieval monks found Terence useful for teaching Latin grammar, so they copied his plays frequently. Not necessarily the most important works, but the ones that happened to be useful in a particular educational context. The losses were gradual and cumulative. Each disaster, each war, each fire, each flood, each period of political instability during which copying and preservation weren't priorities, removed some portion of the textual heritage. Individual losses might be small, but over centuries they added up. By the time Renaissance humanists began systematically searching for classical texts, much was already gone. The texts they found and printed, which became the basis for modern classical scholarship, were the survivors, the tough ones that had made it through multiple centuries of hazards. What didn't survive we mostly know about through mentions in works that did survive, tantalizing references to books we'll never read. But here's the crucial point that needs to be emphasized. The Alexandrian method survived even when many Alexandrian texts didn't. The approach to knowledge, systematic collection, careful organization, critical textual analysis, the idea that scholarship should be institutionally supported, the practice of writing commentaries and creating reference works. This methodological legacy outlasted the physical library. When Byzantine scholars catalogued their libraries, they were following principles established at Alexandria. When Islamic scholars organized the House of Wisdom, they were implementing a model that descended from Alexandria. When medieval European universities developed, they inherited organizational and pedagogical practices that had roots in Alexandria's approach to knowledge. The Renaissance humanists who searched for classical texts in monastery libraries, who learned Greek to read ancient authors in the original, who developed new scholarly methods for establishing accurate texts, they were continuing work that Alexandria had begun. The printing revolution of the 15th century meant that texts could finally be reproduced in thousands of identical copies, eliminating the manuscript copying errors that had plagued textual transmission for millennia. But the editorial principles that humanists used to prepare texts for printing, comparing manuscripts, identifying errors, making critical judgments, these were refinements of methods that Alexandrian scholars had developed. Modern libraries, with their systematic cataloguing, their reference systems, their commitment to comprehensive collection and preservation, are intellectual descendants of Alexandria. The Library of Congress classification system, the Dewey Decimal System, modern subject cataloguing, these are vastly more sophisticated than Callimachus's Pinax, but they're addressing the same fundamental problem. How do you organize a large collection of information so that people can find what they need? The specific solutions are modern, but the problem and the basic approach, systematic classification based on content, descends from ancient precedents. Modern research universities, bringing together scholars from different disciplines, providing institutional support for research, maintaining libraries as core scholarly infrastructure, are following a model that the Ptolemies pioneered at Alexandria. The specific forms are different. Modern universities operate nothing like the ancient museum, but the basic concept of state-supported research institutions with interdisciplinary scholarly communities derives from ancient precedents. When governments fund basic research, when scholars collaborate across disciplines, when universities maintain comprehensive research libraries, Alexandria's legacy is present. The practice of scholarly citation, of acknowledging sources, of distinguishing between original work and borrowed ideas, developed partly from ancient scholarly practices. Alexandrian scholars weren't always consistent or rigorous about citation by modern standards, but they established the principle that sources should be acknowledged. Modern citation practices, with their footnotes and bibliographies and standardized formats, are elaborate developments of this basic principle. The idea that intellectual honesty requires crediting sources goes back at least to Alexandria's scholarly culture. Let's think about what Alexandria proved was possible. A government could fund scholarship for its own sake, not just for immediate practical returns. Scholars from different backgrounds and specializations could work together productively. Systematic collection and organization of knowledge could advance understanding beyond what individual scholars working alone could achieve. Textual criticism and careful editing could improve the accuracy of transmitted texts. Translation could make knowledge accessible across linguistic boundaries. Knowledge, properly recorded and distributed, could outlast the institutions that created it. These weren't obvious truths before Alexandria demonstrated them. Many societies before and since have not invested in systematic scholarship. Many have not supported intellectual work beyond what had immediate practical application. Many have not preserved knowledge systematically or made it widely accessible. Alexandria showed that these investments could pay off, not just in practical benefits, but in cultural prestige and intellectual advancement. The model wasn't perfectly implemented. It couldn't be, given human limitations and historical contingencies, but it was successful enough to be worth imitating and adapting. The library as method concept is crucial for understanding why Alexandria remains relevant. If we think of the Library of Alexandria as primarily a building full of scrolls, then its destruction is simply a loss, a tragic but closed chapter of history. But if we think of it as a set of practices and principles for collecting, organizing, preserving and transmitting knowledge, then it's not lost at all. Those practices evolved and spread, adapted to different contexts, survived through institutional changes and cultural transformations. The physical library burned or decayed, but the intellectual project continued in various forms across different times and places. This isn't to minimize the real losses. The books that burned are genuinely gone, and that's lamentable. The knowledge we don't have because ancient texts were destroyed is a permanent loss to human culture. We would be richer if more had survived, and the destruction, whether through deliberate violence, accidental disaster, or simple neglect, represents failures that we should acknowledge and learn from. But the story isn't just about loss, it's also about survival, transmission, adaptation, and the remarkable durability of knowledge when it's been properly recorded and distributed. The lesson for modern knowledge preservation is clear. Don't rely on single points of failure. Distribute copies widely, use multiple formats and storage methods. Ensure that the methods and principles for organizing and accessing knowledge are documented and taught, so they can survive even if specific collections are lost. Maintain redundancy because disasters will happen. Support institutions that preserve knowledge, but don't assume any single institution is permanent. These lessons, which modern archivists and librarians understand well, were demonstrated by Alexandria's history, both its achievements and its ultimate destruction. We're living in an era where digital technologies have transformed knowledge storage and transmission. The entire contents of ancient Alexandria could fit on a thumb drive. The internet makes information accessible globally, at scales that would have seemed miraculous to ancient scholars. But digital storage brings its own vulnerabilities. File formats become obsolete. Storage media degrade. Digital infrastructure requires constant maintenance, and the sheer volume of information creates new organizational challenges. The problems aren't the same as managing papyrus scrolls, but they're conceptually related. How do you organize massive amounts of information? How do you preserve it for future generations? How do you make it accessible to people who need it? These questions persist across different technological contexts. Alexandria's fundamental insight was that knowledge requires infrastructure. The brilliant individual scholar working in isolation is limited by what they personally know and can access. Give that scholar institutional support, a salary, a workspace, access to comprehensive collections, colleagues to discuss ideas with, scribes to help with copying, and their capacity for intellectual work multiplies. Modern academia understands this, which is why universities maintain libraries, provide research support, create collaborative environments. The specific mechanisms differ from ancient Alexandria, but the principle remains. Knowledge work requires infrastructure, and building that infrastructure is a worthwhile social investment. The collective meal that museum scholars shared, that seemingly minor detail about communal dining, represented something important about knowledge creation. Scholarship isn't purely individual, it's also social, emerging from conversations, debates, collaborative work, mutual criticism and support. Modern academia has coffee rooms and conferences, colloquia and workshops, all serving similar social functions. When scholars eat together, talk informally, share work in progress, they're engaging in knowledge work that's less formal than publications, but no less important. Alexandria understood this implicitly through its institutional structure, and the principle remains valid. The universalist ambition, to collect all books, to comprehend all knowledge, was ultimately impossible, but it was productive to try. Aiming for comprehensive collection meant casting a wide net, preserving texts that might otherwise have been lost, creating resources that enabled scholarship across multiple fields. The goal was unreachable, but pursuing it produced valuable results. Modern libraries have different collecting strategies, but many maintain the principle that broad collecting is valuable, even if true comprehensiveness is impossible. Special collections, digital archives, institutional repositories all reflect the idea that preserving a wide range of materials serves future scholarship in ways we can't fully predict. So as we close this story, we should acknowledge both what was lost and what survived, both the tragedy of destruction and the success of transmission. The Library of Alexandria is gone, and that's genuinely sad. But Alexandria's intellectual legacy survived, evolved, and continues to influence how we approach knowledge. Every comprehensive library, every scholarly community, every citation in a footnote, every careful edition of a classical text carries forward something that Alexandria established. The buildings fell, but the work continued. The scrolls burned, but the knowledge spread widely enough that much of it survived elsewhere. The institution failed, but the methods it developed outlasted any physical structure. That's probably the best kind of immortality an institution can achieve, not surviving unchanged, which is impossible, but influencing what comes after, shaping how future generations approach the problems you grappled with, contributing to an ongoing conversation that extends far beyond your original context. Alexandria didn't preserve everything, didn't solve every problem, didn't create a perfect system. But it demonstrated what was possible when societies decided that knowledge was valuable enough to invest in systematically. And that demonstration echoes still every time a library opens its doors, every time a scholar receives institutional support for research, every time knowledge is preserved and transmitted to future generations. The library is gone, but the work continues. And really that's what Alexandria was ultimately about. Not the building, but the work. Not the collection, but the mission. Not the scrolls, but the knowledge they contained and the methods for preserving and extending that knowledge. So sleep well tonight, knowing that while much was lost, much also survived. The knowledge that ancient scholars worked so hard to preserve reached us through transmission chains spanning millennia and continents. The methods they developed for organizing and understanding that knowledge evolved into modern scholarship. The institutional model they pioneered continues in universities and research libraries around the world. Alexandria fell, but its work didn't end. The conversation continues, the knowledge grows, and we're all participants in an intellectual project that stretches back through Alexandria to the ancient world and forward into whatever future we create. Rest easy. The library may be gone, but what it represented, the human commitment to preserving and advancing knowledge, survives in every library, every university, every research institution working today. Good night, everyone. Sweet dreams. And remember, the most important library is the one we're still building together right now.